Hello there, night owls. Tonight we're wandering into some of the most fascinating architectural stories you've probably never heard. We're talking about the dreamers who literally built our world. Architects and city planners whose greatest creations started as bizarre visions in their sleep. Now, before you settle in with your favorite pillow, hit that like button if you're into these weird historical deep dives, and subscribe if you actually want more of this strange stuff. I'm genuinely curious. Drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from tonight and what time it is where you are. It's always wild to think about all the different places people are drifting off to these stories. Get comfortable, maybe dim those lights, because tonight we're exploring how some of history's most incredible buildings and entire city layouts began as nothing more than fleeting dream images. And hey, if you end up falling asleep before I finish talking about dream architecture, well, that's pretty much the whole idea here, isn't it? You know what's crazy? Every single day you walk past buildings, drive through neighborhoods, maybe even live in places that exist because someone somewhere had the weirdest dream and thought, yeah, I should probably build that. It's like the ultimate follow your dreams success story, except way more literal and involving significantly more concrete. So let's dive into what might be the strangest case of dream-inspired city planning I've ever come across. Picture this, it's 1666. London is literally still smoldering from the Great Fire. And Christopher Wren, this brilliant architect who's probably having the worst week of his professional life, keeps having the same bizarre dream. Every night he's flying over London like some kind of 17th century superhero, but instead of seeing the charred ruins below, he's seeing this impossibly beautiful city with wide streets, elegant churches, and these perfectly planned squares. I mean, imagine waking up from dreams where you're basically Google Earth, but for a city that doesn't exist yet. Now, Christopher Wren wasn't just some random guy having architectural fantasies. This dude was already a professor of astronomy at Oxford, a founding member of the Royal Society, and honestly, one of the smartest people alive at the time. But here's the thing, he'd never designed a building in his life. His expertise was in mathematics, physics, and staring at stars through telescopes. So when London burned down and suddenly everyone's looking around going, hey, who wants to rebuild an entire city? It's pretty weird that this astronomy professor starts having incredibly detailed architectural dreams. The fire had been absolutely devastating. We're talking about 4/5 of the old medieval city just gone. 13,000 houses, 87 churches, and most of the major civic buildings reduced to ash and rubble. The smell of smoke hung over the Thames for weeks. People were living in tents in the fields outside the city walls, and King Charles II was basically staring at the biggest urban planning disaster in English history. But here's where Wren's dreams get really specific and weird. He wasn't just dreaming about pretty buildings, he was experiencing the city from multiple perspectives simultaneously. In his dream journals, which thankfully survived, he describes flying above London at dawn, seeing the morning light hit these wide boulevards at perfect angles. Then suddenly he's walking through the streets as a regular person, feeling how the wider roads create better airflow and reduce the claustrophobic feeling of medieval London's narrow alleys. The most disturbing part? Wren claimed he could smell different types of stone in his dreams. Portland stone, Bath stone, even imported marble. He'd wake up with his hands tingling as if he'd been physically touching these materials all night. His servants reported finding him some mornings with actual dirt under his fingernails, though he'd never left his bedchamber. When the Royal Commission for Rebuilding London was established, Wren wasn't even supposed to be involved. The original plan was to hire established architects, maybe bring in some expertise from France or Italy. But Wren kept showing up to meetings with these incredibly detailed drawings based on his dreams, and the level of urban planning sophistication was unlike anything anyone had seen before. His dream London had these revolutionary features that seemed almost impossibly advanced for the 1660s. Wide boulevards that would allow fire engines to actually reach burning buildings. Remember, the Great Fire had spread so rapidly partly because the narrow medieval streets made it impossible to get firefighting equipment where it was needed. Public squares that would serve as fire breaks and gathering spaces. A logical street grid that would improve trade and commerce. But here's what really freaked people out. Wren's dreams included specific architectural details that he shouldn't have known. The correct proportions for classical columns, the proper way to distribute weight in large stone buildings, even the mathematical relationships between building height and street width that would optimize both sunlight and wind flow. This guy was a mathematician, not an architect, yet his dreams were providing him with centuries of accumulated building knowledge. The king's surveyor, a guy named John Evelyn, was initially skeptical. He thought Wren was just some academic trying to get involved in the biggest construction project in English history. But when Wren presented his street plan, which included detailed layouts for over 50 new churches, each one positioned to serve specific neighborhoods while creating visual focal points throughout the city, Evelyn realized this wasn't just ambitious dreaming. This was sophisticated urban planning. Charles II was dealing with enormous political and economic pressure to rebuild London quickly. The city was the economic heart of England, and every day it remained in ruins was costing the crown massive amounts of tax revenue. Parliament was breathing down his neck, foreign investors were getting nervous, and there were genuine concerns that London might never recover its status as a major European capital. So, when this astronomy professor shows up with a complete rebuilding plan that he claims came from dreams, and the plan actually makes sense both practically and economically, the king decides to take the risk. In September 1666, just days after the fire was finally extinguished, Charles II appointed Wren as one of 3 commissioners responsible for rebuilding London. The weird part is that Wren's dreams didn't stop once he got the official appointment. If anything, they became more detailed and specific. He started having these incredibly vivid architectural visions where he could see inside the walls of buildings, understanding how weight moved through stone and timber, how to create spaces that felt both grand and intimate. His most famous dream involved St. Paul's Cathedral. The old medieval cathedral had been completely destroyed in the fire, and rebuilding it was going to be the most important architectural project in England. Wren claimed he had a recurring dream where he was standing inside a vast domed space, with light streaming down from above in a way that made him feel like he was experiencing heaven on earth. But here's where it gets really strange. In his dreams, Wren wasn't just seeing the cathedral from a human perspective. He described experiencing the building from the perspective of the stones themselves, feeling the compression and tension forces that would hold the massive dome in place. He could sense exactly how thick the walls needed to be, how the weight should be distributed, even the precise curve of the dome that would create the perfect acoustic properties. When Wren presented his initial design for the new St. Paul's, it was unlike anything that had been built in England before. The massive dome was larger than anything in London, requiring engineering techniques that pushed the boundaries of what was possible with 17th century construction methods. The other commissioners were worried it would collapse. Engineers brought in from across Europe to evaluate the design couldn't figure out how. Wren planned to support such a massive structure. But Wren insisted his dreams had shown him the solution. He developed this incredibly innovative construction method where the dome was actually 3 separate structures: an inner dome that people would see from inside the cathedral, an outer dome that would be visible from the London skyline, and a hidden cone-shaped structure in between that would actually support the weight. It was architectural genius, but it came from a guy who learned engineering in his sleep. The construction of St. Paul's took over 30 years, and throughout that entire time, Wren continued having architectural dreams that guided the project. Workers reported that he would sometimes arrive at the construction site with modifications to the plans based on dreams he'd had the night before. These weren't minor adjustments. Sometimes, he'd completely redesign sections of the building because his dreams had shown him better solutions. One of the most documented cases involved the cathedral's famous Whispering Gallery. Wren had designed it based on a dream where he experienced sound moving through curved space in a way that allowed whispers to travel clearly across the entire circular gallery. The acoustic effect was so specific that it required precise mathematical calculations about the relationship between the gallery's diameter, the curve of the dome, and the materials used in construction. When the Whispering Gallery was finally completed and tested, it worked exactly as Wren had dreamed. A person could whisper against the wall on one side of the gallery, and someone on the opposite side could hear every word clearly, even though the distance was over 100 feet. Acoustic engineers still study this effect today because the mathematics involved in creating such precise sound reflection are incredibly complex. But St. Paul's wasn't the only building where Wren's dreams proved prophetic. He designed 51 other churches throughout London, each one based on specific architectural visions he claimed to receive in his sleep. These weren't cookie-cutter designs. Each church was tailored to its specific location, congregation size, and urban context in ways that suggested incredibly sophisticated planning. The Church of St. Mary Le Bow, for example, was designed around a dream where Wren experienced the sound of church bells traveling through London's rebuilt streets. He positioned the church and designed its tower specifically to create optimal acoustics for the famous Bow bells, which according to tradition define who can be considered a true Londoner. The mathematical precision required to calculate how bell sounds would bounce off other buildings and carry through the city streets was far beyond what most architects of the time could achieve. St. Bride's Church, with its distinctive wedding cake spire, came from a dream where Wren saw layers of light ascending toward heaven. He described the vision as experiencing architecture from the perspective of light itself, understanding how different levels of the spire would catch and reflect sunlight throughout the day. The resulting design created this beautiful effect where the spire seems to glow from within during certain times of day, particularly at sunrise and sunset. What's really unsettling is that Wren's architectural dreams seem to include knowledge of London's hidden geography that wasn't available through normal surveying methods. His church placements took into account underground water sources, soil conditions, and even the location of ancient Roman foundations that weren't discovered until centuries later during archaeological excavations. The Church of St. Stephen Walbrook, built directly over a buried Ramong temple, was positioned exactly to take advantage of the existing foundation stones. Wren claimed his dreams had shown him the precise location of these ancient supports, allowing him to build a much more stable structure than should have been possible on that site. When archaeologists finally excavated the area in the 20th century, they found that Wren's church was indeed built directly on top of a Roman temple foundation, with the weight distribution planned to utilize the ancient stonework. Modern structural engineers who've studied Wren's London churches have found that many of them incorporate building techniques that weren't officially developed until the 18th or 19th centuries. His use of iron reinforcement, his understanding of how different materials expand and contract with temperature changes, even his innovative approaches to foundation design, all of this suggests access to engineering, knowledge that was far ahead of his time. The most disturbing aspect of Wren's architectural dreams was how they affected his personal life. His wife, Faith, kept a diary throughout the rebuilding of London, and her entries describe how her husband would sometimes spend entire nights walking through their house, apparently believing he was inspecting construction sites. He'd run his hands along walls, testing for structural integrity, or stand in doorways measuring proportions with his eyes. Faith wrote about finding Christopher in their garden at dawn, sketching elaborate architectural plans in the dirt with a stick, completely unaware of where he was or what he was doing. When she'd wake him, he'd have no memory of the nocturnal design sessions, but the drawings in the dirt were often incredibly detailed and mathematically precise. The psychological toll of receiving architectural visions in dreams for over 3 decades seems to have been significant. Wren's later writings include references to feeling like he was living in 2 different cities simultaneously, the physical London he walked through during the day, and the dream London that existed in his sleep. He complained that sometimes he couldn't tell which version was real, and would become disoriented when buildings didn't match his dream memories. By the end of his life, Wren claimed that his architectural dreams had become so vivid and detailed that he could walk through entire buildings in his sleep, experiencing them from multiple perspectives simultaneously. He described dreams where he was the architect, the builder, the stones themselves, and the people using the buildings all at the same time. When Christopher Wren died in 1723, He left behind not just the physical buildings he designed, but also thousands of pages of dream journals documenting his architectural visions. These manuscripts, kept in the Royal Society's archives, provide an incredible window into the mind of someone who literally dreamed a city into existence. The inscription on his tomb in St. Paul's Cathedral reads, "Si monumentum requiris circumspice." If you seek his monument, look around. But maybe it should read something more like, "If you seek his dreams, look around." Because that's really what London became, the physical manifestation of one man's incredibly detailed architectural nightmares and fantasies. Okay, so we're jumping back to 12th century Cambodia now. Because apparently architects having prophetic dreams is like a cross-cultural thing that spans continents and centuries. There's this guy, and honestly, the historical records are a bit fuzzy on his actual name because apparently medieval Cambodians were about as good at keeping architect credits as modern Hollywood is at crediting visual effects artists, but the few surviving inscriptions refer to him as Kavendra Remethena, which roughly translates to the one who speaks with stone. For the sake of our sanity, let's just call him the Master Builder, because trying to pronounce Sanskrit names correctly while you're falling asleep is probably not going to end well for anyone. This dude claims that Vishnu himself, yes, the four-armed Hindu deity who's basically responsible for maintaining the cosmic order, appeared in his dreams and showed him the exact layout for what would become Angkor Wat. Now, I don't know about you, but if a major deity showed up in my dreams with architectural blueprints, I'd probably wake up thinking I ate some questionable temple food and maybe I should lay off the fermented rice wine. But this guy, he's taking notes. Literal dream notes about temple measurements, moat dimensions, the precise alignment of towers with celestial bodies, the works. The dream apparently lasted for 7 consecutive nights, which, side note, sounds absolutely exhausting. Like, can you imagine trying to remember divine blueprints for a week straight? I can barely remember what I had for breakfast yesterday. And this guy is supposedly downloading the construction plans for the largest religious monument in the world directly from a Hindu, God's cosmic architectural firm. But here's where the story gets really specific and weird. According to the inscriptions found at Angkor Wat itself, the master builder didn't just have vague spiritual visions about building a nice temple. These dreams were incredibly detailed technical specifications. He claimed Vishnu showed him exactly how deep to dig the foundation trenches, the precise angle at which to cut the sandstone blocks, even the mathematical ratios that would make the temple's proportions harmonize with the movement of celestial bodies. The first night's dream supposedly focused on the overall layout, Vishnu appearing as this massive figure whose body formed the template for the temple complex. His torso became the central temple mountain, his arms extended to show where the outer walls should be built, and his legs indicated the precise boundaries of the massive rectangular moat that would surround the entire complex. What's really unsettling is that the master builder claimed he could feel the weight of the future building in his dreams. He described experiencing the temple from the perspective of its foundation stones, feeling the immense pressure of millions of tons of carved sandstone that would eventually rest on the bedrock beneath Angkor Wat. He knew exactly how deep to dig, how to prepare the ground, even which areas of the foundation would need additional reinforcement to support the temple's massive towers. The second night's dream got into the specifics of the temple's astronomical alignment. Vishnu supposedly showed the master builder how the temple should be positioned to mirror the constellation Draco, with the 5 central towers representing the 5 peaks of Mount Meru, the sacred mountain at the center of the Hindu universe. But this wasn't just symbolic positioning, the alignment was mathematically precise, designed to mark specific celestial events like equinoxes and solstices. Here's what's really crazy about this astronomical alignment. The calculations required to position a massive stone complex so that it perfectly mirrors celestial movements were far beyond what 12th century Cambodian mathematics should have been able to achieve. We're talking about predicting the positions of stars and planets decades into the future, accounting for the slow wobble of Earth's axis, even compensating for the gradual shift of stellar positions over time. Modern astronomers who've studied Angkor Wat have found that the temple's alignment is so precise that it can be used as a giant stone calendar, marking not just yearly cycles but also longer astronomical periods that last for centuries. Either the master builder was receiving divine mathematical knowledge in his dreams, or 12th century Cambodia had access to astronomical calculation, methods that we didn't think existed until the Renaissance. The third night's dream focused on the temple's hydraulic engineering, which is honestly the most impressive and mysterious aspect of the entire complex. Vishnu supposedly showed the master builder an incredibly sophisticated water management system that would not only supply the temple with fresh water, but also create a symbolic representation of the cosmic ocean that surrounds Mount Meru in Hindu cosmology. The moat around Angkor Wat isn't just a decorative water feature. It's a precisely engineered hydraulic system that connects to a network of canals, reservoirs, and water channels that extends for miles around the temple complex. The master builder claimed his dreams showed him exactly how to calculate water flow rates, how to build channels that would maintain consistent water levels despite seasonal flooding, even how to create artificial islands within the moat that would serve both practical and symbolic purposes. But here's the kicker: when modern hydraulic engineers analyze the water management system at Angkor Wat, they find that it uses principles of fluid dynamics that weren't officially discovered until the 18th century. The precise angles of the channels, the calculated dimensions of the reservoirs, even the positioning of overflow systems that prevent flooding during monsoon season, all of this suggests access to engineering knowledge that was centuries ahead of its time. The fourth night's dream dealt with the temple's incredible stone carving program. Angkor Wat is covered with over 3,000 individual sculptural figures, including massive relief panels that tell the stories of Hindu epics like the Ramayana and Mahabharata. The master builder claimed that Vishnu showed him not just what scenes to carve, but exactly how to organize teams of stoneworkers to complete such a massive artistic project. The logistics of carving Angkor Wat are mind-boggling. We're talking about quarrying, transporting, and carving millions of tons of sandstone, much of it brought from quarries that were over 25 miles away. The master builder supposedly dreamed about the entire supply chain, which routes to use for transporting stone blocks, how to organize work crews, even the specific tools and techniques that would be needed for different types of carving. What's really strange is that the stone carving at Angkor Wat shows a level of artistic and technical consistency that suggests incredible organization and planning. Despite involving hundreds of individual craftsmen working over several decades, the sculptural program maintains unified style and proportions throughout the entire complex. Either the master builder was an incredibly skilled project manager, or his dreams provided him with detailed knowledge of how to coordinate massive construction projects. The fifth night's dream supposedly revealed the temple's acoustic properties. Vishnu showed the master builder how the temple's stone galleries and chambers could be designed to create specific sound effects during religious ceremonies. The long corridor galleries that surround the central temple were positioned and proportioned to create echo effects that would amplify chanting and ritual music. Modern acoustic engineers who've studied Angkor Wat have found that the temple's stone architecture creates remarkably sophisticated sound effects. Certain corridors amplify specific frequencies, while others create reverberation patterns that can make a single voice sound like a chorus. The central tower has acoustic properties that allow sounds from the base to be clearly heard at the top, over 200 feet above. The sixth night's dream focused on the temple's symbolic program, the incredibly complex iconography that turns the entire building into a three-dimensional representation of Hindu cosmology. Every architectural element, from the smallest decorative detail to the overall proportions of the temple towers, was designed to communicate specific religious and philosophical concepts. The master builder claimed that Vishnu showed him how the temple should be read like a massive stone book, with different levels representing different realms of existence. The outer walls and galleries represent the earthly realm, filled with scenes of human activity and warfare. The inner sanctuaries represent the divine realm, decorated with images of gods and celestial beings. The central tower represents the axis of the universe, the connection between earth and heaven. But here's what's really impressive: the symbolic program at Angkor Wat is so sophisticated and internally consistent that it suggests access to incredibly detailed knowledge of Hindu theology and cosmology. The master builder wasn't just building a temple, he was creating a physical manifestation of an entire religious worldview, complete with complex philosophical concepts about the nature of reality, time, and divine consciousness. The seventh and final night's dream supposedly revealed the temple's ultimate purpose, not just as a place of worship, but as a machine for spiritual transformation. Vishnu showed the master builder how the temple's architecture, artwork, and acoustic properties would work together to create experiences that could elevate human consciousness and provide direct access to divine knowledge. The master builder claimed that his final dream allowed him to experience the completed temple from the perspective of future pilgrims and worshippers. He could see how people would move through the complex, how the gradual ascent from the outer galleries to the central tower would create a psychological journey from earthly concerns to spiritual enlightenment. What's really fascinating is that modern visitors to Angkor Wat often report having profound spiritual experiences while exploring the temple. Even if they're not Hindu and don't understand the religious symbolism, there's something about the proportions, the lighting, the acoustic properties, and the overall design that seems to affect people on a deep psychological level. When construction actually began on Angkor Wat, the master builder faced challenges that would have been impossible to anticipate through normal architectural planning. The site chosen for the temple, supposedly revealed in his dreams, turned out to have incredibly complex geological conditions. The bedrock was uneven. There were underground water sources that could have destabilized the foundation, and the soil composition varied significantly across the massive temple complex. But somehow, the master builder's construction plans accounted for all of these geological challenges. His foundation design included drainage systems that dealt with underground water flow. His building techniques adapted to different soil conditions, and his structural supports were positioned to take advantage of the most stable areas of bedrock. Modern geological surveys of the Angkor Wat site have found that the temple's foundation system is remarkably sophisticated, using techniques that demonstrate detailed knowledge of soil mechanics and structural engineering. The master builder somehow knew exactly where to place the heaviest stone elements, how to create stable foundations in areas with challenging soil conditions, even how to prevent erosion and water damage that could have destroyed the temple over time. The construction of Angkor Wat took approximately 30 years and involved an estimated 300,000 workers, including skilled stonemasons, sculptors, engineers, and laborers. Organizing and managing such a massive workforce would have been an incredible logistical challenge, requiring detailed planning for everything from food supplies and housing to tool distribution and work scheduling. The master builder claimed that his dreams continued throughout the construction period, providing him with solutions to problems as they arose. Workers reported that he would sometimes arrive at the construction site with modifications to the building plans, claiming that Vishnu had appeared in his dreams the night before to show him better approaches to specific technical challenges. One of the most documented cases involved the construction of the temple's central tower, which rises over 200 feet above the surrounding galleries. The engineering challenges involved in building such a massive stone structure, particularly at the top of an already complex multi-level temple, were enormous. The master builder's original plans called for construction techniques that his engineers couldn't figure out how to implement safely. But after a series of dreams, the master builder developed an innovative approach to building the central tower using a combination of precisely cut interlocking stones and hidden internal supports. The technique was so advanced that it wasn't used in other Cambodian temples until centuries later, and modern structural engineers still study the central tower's construction methods. The stone carving program at Angkor Wat also presented logistical challenges that the master builders seemed to solve through dream guidance. The temple's relief panels tell complex stories from Hindu epics, that organizing the narrative program so that it flows logically around the temple's corridors and galleries required incredible attention to detail. The master builder claimed that his dreams showed him exactly how to sequence the stone carvings so that visitors would encounter the stories in the correct narrative order as they moved through the temple complex. The result is a sculptural program that functions like a massive graphic novel, with individual scenes connecting to create larger epic narratives. But here's what's really strange. The relief panels at Angkor Wat include scenes from Hindu epics that weren't widely known in 12th century Cambodia. Some of the stories depicted in the stone carvings come from Sanskrit, texts that weren't translated into Khmer until centuries later. Either the master builder had access to Sanskrit religious literature that wasn't available to other Cambodians, or his dreams were providing him with knowledge of Hindu mythology that came from sources beyond his normal cultural environment. The hydraulic engineering at Angkor Wat also continued to evolve throughout the construction period, with the master builder making modifications to the water management system based on additional dream guidance. The final version of the temple's water system was far more sophisticated than the original plans, including features like adjustable flow controls and overflow channels that could handle extreme weather conditions. Modern hydrologists who've studied the Angkor Wat water system have found that it incorporates advanced principles of fluid dynamics that suggest incredibly sophisticated understanding of water flow patterns. The precise positioning of channels and reservoirs, the calculated dimensions of the moat, even the integration of the temple's water system with the broader hydraulic network of the Angkor region, all of this demonstrates engineering knowledge that was far ahead of its time. The most unsettling aspect of the master builder's dream-guided construction was how it affected his personal life and psychological state. Contemporary inscriptions describe him as becoming increasingly detached from normal human concerns as the temple neared completion. He would spend days at a time in meditation, claiming that he was receiving final instructions from Vishnu about the temple's spiritual activation. His assistants reported that the master builder would sometimes stand in front of partially completed sections of the temple and carry on conversations with invisible entities, apparently receiving guidance about construction details from divine sources. He would walk through the temple complex at night, checking alignments and proportions by starlight, claiming that certain aspects of the temple could only be properly evaluated under specific celestial conditions. When Angkor Wat was finally completed, the master builder reportedly spent his final years living as a hermit within the temple complex, claiming that his dreams had evolved from architectural visions to direct divine communion. He died while meditating in the temple's central sanctuary, and according to local tradition, his body was found in a position that perfectly mirrored the main statue of Vishnu in the temple's innermost shrine. The temple he left behind was not just a remarkable architectural achievement, but also a functioning spiritual machine that continued to affect people's consciousness centuries after its construction. Angkor Wat became a pilgrimage destination that attracted visitors from across the Hindu and Buddhist worlds, and many pilgrims reported having profound spiritual experiences while visiting the temple. But here's what's really strange. Throughout the centuries following the master builder's death, there were recurring reports of people having dreams about Angkor Wat that provided them with new insights into the temple's meaning and purpose. Scholars, pilgrims, and even casual visitors would dream about the temple's hidden symbolism, its astronomical alignments, or its spiritual significance. Modern archaeologists working at Angkor Wat have reported unusually vivid dreams about the temple's original construction, sometimes providing insights that led to important discoveries about the temple's history and engineering. It's as if the master builder's original architectural dreams somehow imprinted themselves on the stone structure, continuing to communicate with people who spend time in the temple complex. When you consider that Angkor Wat has stood for over 800 years, surviving wars, natural disasters, and centuries of tropical weather, it's remarkable that a building designed through dream visions has proven to be so durable and enduring. The master builder's divine architectural guidance resulted in a structure that has become one of the most important cultural landmarks in human history. The temple complex covers over 400 acres, making it larger than many modern cities, and every square foot was supposedly planned according to divine architectural guidance received in dreams. That's not just ambitious, it's almost incomprehensibly vast in scope and vision. Fast forward to 1850s Paris, and we've got Baron Haussmann having what can only be described as the most productive stress dreams in history. This guy was literally having nightmares about urban planning, which sounds like the most boring anxiety dreams imaginable until you realize that his nocturnal city planning sessions ended up completely transforming one of the world's most important cities. Georges Eugene Haussmann wasn't supposed to be redesigning Paris. He was a provincial bureaucrat from the Bordeaux region, a guy who'd spent most of his career dealing with rural administrative problems, like crop taxation and village road maintenance. But in 1853, Napoleon III, who had his own weird obsession with urban modernization, appointed Haussmann as prefect of the Seine, basically putting him in charge of transforming Paris into a modern imperial capital. The problem was that mid-19th century Paris was an absolute disaster from an urban planning perspective. We're talking about a medieval city that had grown organically over centuries, with narrow, winding streets that were perfect for spreading cholera, organizing revolutionary barricades, and generally making it impossible for the government to maintain control over the population. The average street width in central Paris was about 12 feet, barely wide enough for a horse-drawn cart, let alone the kind of modern transportation and commerce that Napoleon III envisioned for his empire. But here's where Haussmann's story gets really strange. Starting almost immediately after his appointment, he began having these incredibly vivid and detailed nightmares about Paris. These weren't just general anxiety dreams about urban problems, they were specific, architecturally detailed visions of the city's narrow streets filled with disease, revolution, and social chaos. In his private journals, which weren't discovered until the 1960s, Haussmann describes these dreams in almost obsessive detail. He'd find himself walking through the maze-like streets of old Paris, but experiencing them from multiple perspectives simultaneously. Sometimes he was a pedestrian trying to navigate the confusing layout. Sometimes he was a disease spreading through the crowded neighborhoods. Sometimes he was a revolutionary trying to build barricades to block government troops. The most disturbing aspect of these dreams was their sensory intensity. Haussmann claimed he could smell the sewage in the streets, feel the claustrophobic pressure of buildings that seemed to lean in toward each other, even taste the polluted air that hung over the city's most crowded neighborhoods. He'd wake up feeling like he'd spent the entire night trapped in the worst parts of Paris, even though he was sleeping in a comfortable mansion in one of the city's better districts. But then, gradually, these nightmare visions began to change. Instead of just experiencing the problems of old Paris, Haussmann started dreaming about solutions. He'd have these incredibly detailed visions of wide, tree-lined boulevards cutting through the medieval street pattern like surgical incisions. He could see exactly where these new streets should be positioned to improve air circulation, facilitate commerce, and most importantly from Napoleon III's perspective, make it impossible for revolutionaries to block government access to any part of the city. The precision of these dream visions was remarkable. Haussmann would wake up with detailed mental maps of how the new street system should be laid out, including specific measurements for street widths, the positioning of public squares, even the angles at which new boulevards should intersect with existing roads to create optimal traffic flow. What's really fascinating is that Haussmann claimed his dreams showed him Paris from an aerial perspective, even though flight wasn't possible in the 1850s. He described soaring over the city like a bird, seeing the entire urban layout spread out below him, understanding how different neighborhoods connected to each other and where the bottlenecks and inefficiencies were located. These aerial dream visions allowed Haussmann to conceptualize Paris as a unified system rather than a collection of separate neighborhoods. He could see how improving transportation in one area would affect commerce in another, how creating new public spaces would change social dynamics across the entire city, even how the positioning of new buildings would influence everything from air quality to political stability. The most obsessive aspect of Haussmann's architectural dreams was his fixation on light. He claimed that his dream Paris was always bathed in this golden, almost supernatural illumination that made everything look magical and harmonious. The wide boulevards in his visions were specifically oriented to catch and channel sunlight, creating these dramatic lighting effects that would transform the visual experience of moving through the city. This dream lighting became one of Haussmann's most important design principles. When he actually began redesigning Paris, he insisted that the new boulevards be positioned to optimize natural light throughout the day. The famous Champs-Élysées, the Boulevard Saint-Germain, even the smaller residential streets in areas like the 16th arrondissement, all of these were laid out according to calculations about how sunlight would hit the buildings at different times of day and different seasons of the year. Modern urban planners who've studied Haussmann's street layouts have found that his light optimization strategies were remarkably sophisticated, taking into account not just the daily movement of the sun, but also seasonal variations and the reflective properties of different building materials. Either Haussmann was a master of solar geometry, or his dreams were providing him with incredibly detailed knowledge about how light behaves in urban environments. The psychological effect of redesigning an entire city based on dream visions seems to have been intense for Haussmann. His wife, Octavie, kept a detailed diary throughout the Paris renovation period, and her entries describe her husband's increasingly obsessive behavior as the project progressed. She wrote about finding Georges wandering through their house at night, apparently believing he was walking through the streets of Paris. He'd measure doorways and hallways with his hands, as if checking the proportions of imaginary boulevards. He'd stand at windows staring out at the city, sketching invisible street layouts in the air with his fingers. Most disturbingly, Octavie reported that her husband would sometimes wake up in the middle of the night and start redesigning their own house based on principles he claimed to have learned from his Paris dreams. He'd move furniture around to create better circulation patterns, or insist that certain rooms needed to be reconfigured to achieve proper light optimization. The actual implementation of Haussmann's dream-inspired urban planning was one of the most massive and disruptive construction projects in modern history. Between 1853 and 1870, he demolished approximately 60% of central Paris, displacing hundreds of thousands of residents and completely transforming the character of the city. The scale of destruction was unprecedented. Entire neighborhoods that had existed for centuries were simply erased, their medieval street patterns replaced by the wide, straight boulevards that Haussmann had seen in his dreams. The human cost was enormous. Working-class families were forced out of central Paris as their neighborhoods were demolished, and many ended up in overcrowded suburban areas with poor living conditions. But here's the thing, despite the massive disruption and social upheaval, Haussmann's dream-inspired urban planning actually worked. The new boulevards did improve air circulation, reducing the spread of diseases like cholera and tuberculosis. The wider streets made it easier for emergency services to reach all parts of the city. The strategic positioning of public squares created fire breaks that prevented the kind of massive urban fires that had historically devastated Paris. And yes, the new street layout did make it much more difficult for revolutionaries to organize effective resistance against the government. The wide boulevards made it impossible to build traditional barricades, and the strategic positioning of major streets meant that government troops could quickly reach any part of the city. Whether you consider this a positive or negative outcome probably depends on your political perspective, but it definitely achieved Napoleon III's goal of making Paris easier to govern. The most remarkable aspect of Haussmann's boulevard system was how it integrated practical functionality with aesthetic beauty. The tree-lined avenues, the carefully proportioned building heights, the strategic placement of monuments and public spaces, all of this created an urban environment that was both efficiently functional and visually stunning. The famous Haussmann buildings that line the new boulevards, those elegant, six-story structures with their cream-colored stone facades and wrought iron balconies, were designed according to strict architectural guidelines that Haussmann claimed came from his dreams. The building heights were calculated to create optimal proportions relative to street width. The facade materials were chosen to reflect light in ways that would enhance the golden illumination effects he'd seen in his visions. Modern architectural historians have found that the proportional relationships in Haussmann's Paris follow mathematical principles that weren't well understood in the 1850s. The ratios between building height, street width, and public space dimensions create visual harmony effects that influence how people experience the city on a psychological level. People walking through Haussmann's boulevards often report feeling more optimistic and energized than they do in other urban environments. There's something about the proportions, the light quality, and the visual rhythm of the architecture that seems to have a positive effect on mood and well-being. Whether this was a conscious design goal or just a fortunate side effect of Haussmann's dream-inspired planning is impossible to know for certain. The construction techniques used to build Haussmann's Paris were also remarkably advanced for the 1850s. The new boulevards required innovative approaches to foundation work. Since many of them were built over existing medieval streets and buildings, Haussmann's engineers had to figure out how to create stable roadbeds while dealing with underground obstacles like ancient sewers, buried rivers, and the foundations of demolished buildings. Haussmann claimed that his dreams provided him with detailed knowledge about Paris's underground geography, including the locations of hidden water sources, ancient Roman ruins, and areas where the soil conditions would make construction difficult. When his engineers actually began excavating for the new boulevards, they consistently found underground features exactly where Haussmann had predicted they would be. The sewage system that Haussmann designed for the new Paris was particularly innovative. The old city had relied on a haphazard collection of open drains and private waste disposal systems that contributed to the spread of disease and created terrible sanitary conditions. Haussmann's dream visions apparently included detailed plans for a comprehensive underground sewage network that would serve the entire city. The new sewage system was so advanced that it became a tourist attraction in its own right. The underground tunnels were large enough for people to walk through comfortably, and they included sophisticated engineering features like flow regulation systems and maintenance access points. Victor Hugo famously featured Haussmann's sewers in Les Miserables, describing them as an underground city that mirrored the streets above. What's really strange is that Haussmann's sewer system incorporated engineering principles that weren't widely understood until the late 19th century. The precise calculations of flow rates, the strategic positioning of access points, even the materials used for pipe construction. All of this suggests access to hydraulic engineering knowledge that was ahead of its time. The parks and public spaces that Haussmann integrated into his new Paris were also remarkably sophisticated from an urban planning perspective. The Bois de Boulogne, the Bois de Vincennes, and the smaller neighborhood parks scattered throughout the city were positioned to create a network of green spaces that would improve air quality and provide recreation opportunities for all social classes. Haussmann claimed that his dreams showed him exactly how these parks should be designed to complement the new boulevard system. The parks weren't just decorative additions, they were integral components of an urban ecosystem that would make Paris healthier and more livable for its residents. The landscape architecture of Haussmann's parks incorporated principles of environmental design that were far ahead of their time. The strategic planting of trees to improve air circulation, the creation of artificial lakes and water features to moderate local climate, even the positioning of walking paths to encourage social interaction. All of this demonstrates sophisticated understanding of how designed landscapes can influence urban environments. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Haussmann's dream-inspired urban planning was how it created a new model for modern city design that influenced urban development around the world. The wide boulevards, the integration of parks and public spaces, the attention to light and air circulation, these principles became standard features of city planning in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Cities from Buenos Aires to Hanoi adopted elements of Haussmann's Paris model, creating their own versions of tree-lined boulevards and systematically planned urban layouts. The influence of one man's architectural dreams spread across continents, shaping how millions of people experience urban life. The psychological impact of living in Haussmann's redesigned Paris was profound. The wide, light-filled boulevards created a sense of openness and possibility that was completely different from the claustrophobic medieval streets they replaced. The strategic placement of monuments and public spaces created visual focal points that helped people navigate the city and feel connected to its history and culture. But there were also negative psychological effects. Many longtime Paris residents felt disoriented and displaced by the massive changes to their city. The familiar neighborhoods where they'd grown up were simply gone, replaced by elegant but impersonal boulevards that felt foreign and unwelcoming. Haussmann himself seemed to struggle with the psychological weight of having transformed an entire city based on his dreams. In his later writings, he expressed ambivalence about whether his vision had ultimately made Paris a better place to live. He was proud of the technical achievements, the improved sanitation, the better transportation, the reduced disease rates, but he was troubled by the social disruption and cultural losses that had resulted from his massive reconstruction project. The most haunting aspect of Haussmann's story is how his architectural dreams continued to evolve even after the Paris renovation was complete. He spent his final years having increasingly detailed visions of how the city should continue to develop, imagining future improvements and modifications that would never be implemented. His dream journals from the 1880s describe elaborate urban planning schemes that wouldn't become technologically feasible until the 20th century. He envisioned underground transportation systems, multi-level roadways, even buildings that could be reconfigured to adapt to changing urban needs. When Haussmann died in 1891, he left behind not just the physical transformation of Paris, but also a legacy of dreams about urban possibility that continued to influence city planners and architects long after his death. His vision of the modern city as a rationally planned, efficiently functioning, aesthetically beautiful environment became the template for urban development around the world. The Paris that Haussmann created based on his dreams became the most influential model of urban modernity, proving that sometimes the most practical solutions come from the most impractical sources, the mysterious visions that visit us in our sleep. Let's jump to 1950s Brazil, where urban planner Lucio Costa is having the most geometrically specific dreams you've ever heard of. This guy is literally dreaming about flying over Brazil in an airplane, which was still pretty futuristic for most people in the 1950s, and looking down at this perfectly planned city that looked like, well, an airplane. From above, the entire city layout formed the shape of an aircraft, complete with wings, a fuselage, and what would essentially become the cockpit of government. Now, most people would wake up from a dream like that and think, weird dream, maybe I should cut back on the aviation magazines and those Buck Rogers serials. But Costa? He draws it in obsessive detail, and then submits it as his design for Brazil's new capital city in the biggest urban planning competition in South American history. Lucio Costa wasn't supposed to win this thing. He was a relatively unknown architect from Rio de Janeiro, a guy who'd spent most of his career doing residential projects and theoretical work about modernist architecture. The competition for Brazil's new capital was attracting major international firms, established city planners, architects who designed entire urban districts in Europe and North America. Costa was essentially the architectural equivalent of a small-town baseball player showing up to try out for the Yankees. But here's where his story gets really strange. Starting in late 1956, just months before the competition deadline, Costa began having these incredibly vivid dreams about flying over the Brazilian interior. These weren't just pleasant fantasies about soaring through the sky, they were detailed, almost technical visions of urban planning from an aerial perspective that most people in the 1950s had never experienced firsthand. Remember, commercial aviation was still relatively new and expensive in the 1950s. Most Brazilians had never seen their country from above, let alone had the experience of looking down at cities from airplane windows. But Costa claimed his dreams gave him this bird's-eye view of urban planning that allowed him to conceptualize cities as complete, integrated systems rather than collections of individual buildings and streets. The dreams were remarkably consistent and specific. Costa would find himself flying over the Brazilian highlands, looking down at this vast, empty landscape that stretched to the horizon in every direction. Then, gradually, he'd see the outline of a city appearing on the plateau below, not growing organically like traditional cities, but materializing all at once as a complete, unified design. The most striking aspect of these dream visions was how the city's shape seemed to mirror the aircraft he was flying in. The main government buildings formed the fuselage, the residential areas extended like wings, and the whole thing was oriented along flight paths that made perfect sense from an aviation perspective. It was like his subconscious was designing a city that could only be properly understood from the air. What's really fascinating is that Costa claimed his dreams included incredibly technical details about urban planning that he'd never studied formally. He'd wake up with detailed mental maps of traffic flow patterns, calculations about population density, even specific measurements for street widths and building heights. His background was in architecture, not urban planning, yet his dreams were providing him with sophisticated knowledge about city design principles. The Brazilian government's decision to build a new capital wasn't just about urban planning, it was about national identity and geopolitical strategy. President Juscelino Kubitschek wanted to demonstrate that Brazil was a modern, forward-thinking nation capable of incredible achievements. Moving the capital from coastal Rio de Janeiro to the interior would symbolically represent Brazil's commitment to developing its vast interior regions and becoming a major player on the world stage. But building a completely new capital city from scratch in the middle of nowhere was an almost impossibly ambitious project. The site chosen for the new capital, a plateau in the state of Goiás, about 600 miles from Rio de Janeiro, was essentially uninhabited wilderness. There were no existing infrastructure, no transportation networks, no urban services. Everything would have to be created from nothing. When Costa submitted his competition entry in March 1957, it was unlike anything the other competitors had produced. While most of the other designs were elaborate, detailed proposals with extensive technical documentation, Costa's submission was surprisingly simple, just a few sketches and a brief explanatory text that described his airplane-shaped city concept. The jury was initially skeptical. Costa's design seemed almost too simple, too conceptual. Where were the detailed population studies? The infrastructure plans? The economic projections? But as they studied his airplane city concept more carefully, they began to realize that its apparent simplicity was actually sophisticated urban planning disguised as elegant abstraction. The airplane shape wasn't just a gimmick, it was a brilliant solution to the practical challenges of building a new capital city. The central fuselage would contain all the government buildings, creating a monumental axis that would symbolically represent the power and authority of the federal government. The residential wings would extend north and south, allowing for systematic population growth while maintaining clear separation between different urban functions. Costa's design also included features that were remarkably advanced for 1950s urban planning. The entire city was designed around automobile transportation, with wide boulevards and highway-style roadways that anticipated Brazil's future car culture. The residential areas were organized into self-contained superblocks that would include housing, schools, shopping, and recreational facilities, creating neighborhoods that could function almost independently. But here's what really sold the jury on Costa's design. He claimed that his airplane city concept had been tested through dream flights over the proposed site. He described having recurring dreams where he could fly over the plateau and see exactly how his city would look in the landscape, how the buildings would catch the light at different times of day, how the traffic would flow along the major boulevards. The psychological impact of designing a city based on aerial dream visions seems to have been intense for Costa. His wife, Maria Eliza, kept a diary during the competition period, and her entries describe her husband's increasingly obsessive behavior as he refined his airplane city design. She wrote about finding Lucio walking around their Rio de Janeiro apartment with his arms outstretched, apparently believing he was flying over his imaginary city. He'd pace back and forth, describing the urban landscape below as if he were actually soaring over it. He'd point out specific buildings, describe the views from different altitudes, even comment on how the city would look during different seasons. Most disturbing, Maria Eliza reported that her husband would sometimes wake up in the middle of the night and start redrawing his city plans, claiming that his dreams had revealed problems with traffic flow or building placement that needed to be corrected. These weren't minor adjustments. Sometimes he'd completely redesign entire sections of the city based on what he'd seen in his sleep. When Costa was declared the winner of the competition in March 1957, he faced the daunting challenge of turning his dream city into reality. The Brazilian government was committed to completing the new capital in just 3.5 years, an almost impossibly tight timeline for building an entire city from scratch. The construction of Brasilia became one of the most massive and rapid urban development projects in modern history. At the peak of construction, over 60,000 workers were laboring around the clock to build Costa's airplane city. The scale of the project was staggering: millions of tons of concrete, thousands of buildings, hundreds of miles of roads and utility lines, all being constructed simultaneously in the middle of the Brazilian wilderness. Costa claimed that his architectural dreams continued throughout the construction period, providing him with solutions to problems as they arose. Workers reported that he would sometimes arrive at construction sites with modifications to the building plans, explaining that his dreams had shown him better approaches to specific design challenges. One of the most documented cases involved the positioning of the National Congress building, which sits at the cockpit of Costa's airplane city. The original plans called for the building to be oriented due east-west, but Costa had a dream that showed him the building positioned at a slight angle that would create more dramatic lighting effects during sunrise and sunset. The change seemed minor, but it required significant modifications to the surrounding plaza and access roads. When construction workers made the adjustment, they found that Costa's dream-inspired positioning did indeed create spectacular visual effects, with the building's twin towers silhouetted against the sky in ways that became iconic symbols of Brasilia. The residential superblocks that formed the wings of Costa's airplane city were also modified based on his continuing architectural dreams. The original design called for uniform building heights and layouts, but Costa's dreams showed him that different areas of the city would function better with varied building configurations. Some superblocks were redesigned with taller buildings to create dramatic skylines, while others were modified to include more green space and recreational facilities. Costa claimed that his dreams allowed him to experience the city from the perspective of future residents, understanding how different neighborhood layouts would affect people's daily lives and social interactions. The construction techniques used to build Brasilia were remarkably advanced for the 1950s. Costa's airplane city required innovative approaches to foundation work, since the entire city was being built on a high plateau with challenging soil conditions. His dreams apparently provided him with detailed knowledge about the geology of the construction site, including information about underground water sources and soil stability that wasn't available through normal surveying methods. When construction crews actually began excavating for the major buildings, they consistently found ground conditions exactly as Costa had predicted based on his dreams. The foundation work for the government buildings, in particular, required precise knowledge of soil composition and drainage patterns that Costa somehow possessed despite never having conducted geological surveys of the site. The most remarkable aspect of Costa's dream-guided urban planning was how his airplane city design integrated with the natural landscape of the Brazilian plateau. The positioning of major buildings, the orientation of boulevards, even the location of artificial lakes and parks, all of this was supposedly based on dream visions of how the city would look from above. Modern satellite imagery of Brasilia confirms that Costa's airplane city does indeed resemble an aircraft when viewed from above, with the government buildings forming a clear fuselage and the residential areas extending like wings. But what's really impressive is how the city's layout takes advantage of the natural topography and climate of the region. The wide boulevards are oriented to create optimal air circulation, reducing the heat and humidity that can make tropical cities uncomfortable. The artificial lakes were positioned to moderate the local climate and create recreational areas that enhance the quality of life for residents. The parks and green spaces were integrated into the urban fabric in ways that preserved the natural beauty of the Brazilian highlands. Costa's architectural dreams also seem to have included detailed knowledge about how his airplane city would function socially and culturally. The superblock residential areas were designed to encourage interaction between different social classes, with apartment buildings of various sizes and price ranges mixed together in the same neighborhoods. The central monumental axis was designed not just as a government district, but as a symbolic representation of Brazilian national identity. The positioning of the major government buildings, the proportions of the public spaces, even the sightlines between different architectural elements, all of this was calculated to create a sense of national pride and political unity. But here's where Costa's utopian vision ran into the realities of human behavior and social dynamics. The airplane city was designed for a population of about 500,000 people, but Brasilia grew much faster than anticipated. By the time the city was officially inaugurated in 1960, it already had more residents than Costa's original plan had projected. The rapid population growth created problems that Costa's dreams hadn't anticipated. The superblocks became overcrowded, the transportation systems were overwhelmed, and the carefully planned social integration between different economic classes didn't work as intended. Wealthy residents moved to exclusive neighborhoods, while working-class families were pushed to satellite cities on the outskirts of the planned area. Costa himself seems to have been troubled by how his dream city evolved in ways he hadn't foreseen. In his later writings, he expressed disappointment that Brasilia hadn't achieved the social harmony and democratic ideals that had inspired his original airplane city concept. The most unsettling aspect of Costa's story is how his architectural dreams affected his relationship with the city he'd created. After Brasilia was completed, he would make regular visits to walk through the streets and observe how people were actually using the spaces he designed based on his dream visions. His assistants reported that Costa would sometimes stand in the middle of Brasilia's monumental axis, looking up at the sky as if he were trying to recapture the aerial perspective from his original dreams. He described feeling disconnected from the city when he experienced it from ground level, as if the true meaning of his urban design could only be understood from above. Costa also claimed that his dreams about Brasilia continued long after the city's construction was complete. But instead of receiving guidance about new buildings or urban improvements, his later dreams were filled with aerial views of how the city might evolve in the future. He described seeing Brasilia decades in the future, with new buildings and transportation systems that extended his airplane city concept in directions that wouldn't become technologically feasible until much later. The psychological toll of creating a city based on dream visions seems to have been significant for Costa. Friends and family members reported that he became increasingly introspective and philosophical as he aged, often expressing uncertainty about whether his airplane city had been a success or a failure. In one of his final interviews, Costa reflected on the relationship between his dreams and the physical reality of Brasilia. He said that the city had grown beyond his original vision in ways that were both better and worse than he'd imagined. The reality was more complex, more human, and more flawed than his dreams had suggested. But it was also more vital and dynamic than any urban planner could have anticipated. When Lucio Costa died in 1998, he left behind not just the physical city of Brasilia, but also a legacy of dreams about urban possibility that continued to influence city planners and architects around the world. His airplane city demonstrated that sometimes the most practical solutions to urban challenges can come from the most impractical sources, the strange visions that visit us in our sleep. The city he dreamed into existence became the capital of Brazil and a UNESCO World Heritage Site, proving that architectural dreams can literally reshape nations. But Brasilia also became a cautionary tale about the limitations of utopian urban planning, showing that even the most carefully designed cities can't fully control how people choose to live and work together. Costa's airplane city remains one of the most remarkable examples of modernist urban planning, a place where 20th century dreams about the future took physical form in concrete and steel. Whether you consider it a success or a failure probably depends on whether you're looking at it from above, like Costa did in his dreams, or from ground level, like the millions of people who actually live there. The most haunting aspect of Costa's story is that his airplane city was designed to be viewed from a perspective that most of its residents would never experience. It's a city that makes perfect sense when you're flying over it, but can feel confusing and alienating when you're walking through its streets. In a way, Brasilia is the ultimate expression of the modernist dream, a rationally planned, efficiently organized urban environment that sometimes seems designed more for the convenience of planners than the needs of people. Antoni Gaudí might be the weirdest case of dream architecture we've got, because this guy claimed he didn't just dream about buildings, he dreamed he was buildings. Like literally experiencing architecture from the inside, feeling what it was like to be a living, breathing structure with stone bones and tile skin. Starting around 1883, when he began serious work on the Sagrada Familia, Gaudí began having these incredibly vivid dreams where he experienced architecture from perspectives that shouldn't have been possible for a human consciousness. He'd wake up with detailed knowledge of how stone should curve, how light should flow through spaces, how buildings should grow like living organisms rather than being constructed like machines. Now, Antoni Gaudí was already pretty eccentric before his architectural dreams started. This was a guy who'd spent his childhood in rural Catalonia studying insects, plants, and rock formations with an intensity that worried his parents. He'd sit for hours watching how tree branches grew, how water flowed over stones, how light filtered through leaves. His notebooks from architecture school are filled with sketches of natural forms alongside building designs, as if he was trying to figure out how to make buildings that were alive. But the dreams that started in the 1880s were something completely different. These weren't just creative inspiration or artistic visions. They were full-body experiences of being architectural structures. Gaudí described dreams where he could feel the weight of stone pressing down through his body, experience the stress and compression forces that held buildings together, even sense the movement of air and light through spaces as if they were flowing through his own circulatory system. The Sagrada Familia, that bizarre, melting cathedral masterpiece in Barcelona that looks like someone fed a Gothic church hallucinogens for about 50 years, supposedly came from a recurring dream where Gaudí experienced being a forest growing toward heaven. In this dream, he wasn't looking at trees or even imagining himself as a tree. He was experiencing the actual biological processes of growth, feeling sap moving through his trunk, sensing his branches reaching toward sunlight, understanding how his root system anchored him to the earth. When he woke up from these forest cathedral dreams, Gaudí would sketch obsessively, trying to capture the sensation of organic growth in stone and mortar. His drawings from this period show columns that branch like trees, vaults that curve like leaves, decorative elements that seem to be growing rather than carved. But here's where it gets really disturbing. Gaudí claimed that these architectural dreams became more intense and specific as work on the Sagrada Familia progressed. He started having dreams where he could experience the building from multiple perspectives simultaneously. He'd be the foundation stones feeling the weight of the entire structure, the walls sensing the movement of people inside, the towers reaching toward the sky like the arms of a giant stone creature. His assistants at the Sagrada Familia construction site reported increasingly strange behavior from Gaudí as these dreams intensified. He would arrive at work and spend hours standing perfectly still in front of partially completed sections of the cathedral, apparently listening to something that nobody else could hear. When asked what he was doing, he'd explain that he was feeling the building's structural stresses, understanding how the stone wanted to be shaped. The mathematical complexity of Gaudí's architectural designs was far beyond what should have been possible using 1880s construction techniques. The curved surfaces, the complex geometric relationships, the innovative structural solutions modern engineers still study his buildings, because the mathematics involved in creating such organic forms in stone are incredibly sophisticated. Take the columns inside the Sagrada Familia, for example. They're not just decorative elements that happen to look like trees. They're actually engineered to distribute weight the way tree trunks do, with branching patterns that channel structural forces through the building in the most efficient way possible. The geometry required to calculate these load-bearing organic forms wasn't well understood until the development of computer modeling in the late 20th century. But Gaudí somehow knew exactly how to create these structures using nothing but his dream experiences of being a building. He described dreams where he could feel the weight of the cathedral's towers pressing down through his body, and he'd know instinctively how to position the supporting columns to handle these forces. He was doing advanced structural engineering through sensory dreams about architectural biology. The most unsettling aspect of Gaudi's building dreams was how they affected his ability to distinguish between his human body and his architectural creations. His housekeeper, Vicenta, kept detailed notes about his increasingly erratic behavior as the Sagrada Familia construction progressed. She wrote about finding him standing in front of mirrors, running his hands over his own body as if he were examining the surface of a building. He'd press his palms against walls in his house, apparently trying to feel the structural forces inside the masonry. He'd walk through Barcelona touching the facades of other buildings, comparing their health to what he was experiencing in his architectural dreams. Most disturbingly, Vicenta reported that Gaudi would sometimes wake up in the middle of the night and try to walk through the walls of his house, apparently believing that solid barriers should flow around his body the way they did in his dreams. She'd find him standing pressed against walls, pushing gently as if expecting the stone to yield like soft clay. The Park Güell, another of Gaudi's major projects, was designed based on dreams where he experienced being a landscape rather than a building. He described dreams where he could feel the natural topography of the hillside site, understanding how water would flow during rainstorms, sensing where people would naturally want to walk and rest. The famous serpentine bench that winds along the main terrace of Park Güell was supposedly designed based on a dream where Gaudi experienced being the hillside itself, feeling the weight and movement of people as they sat and walked along his surface. The bench's curves aren't just aesthetically pleasing, they're ergonomically designed to support the human body in ways that encourage social interaction and relaxation. But here's what's really weird about the Park Güell bench. It's covered with broken ceramic tiles arranged in abstract patterns that seem random but actually follow complex mathematical relationships. Modern analysis has found that the tile patterns create visual effects that influence brainwave patterns, potentially inducing states of relaxation and creativity in people who spend time sitting on the bench. Either Gaudi was way ahead of his time in understanding environmental psychology, or his dreams were providing him with knowledge about how design spaces affect human consciousness. The tile patterns include color combinations and geometric relationships that weren't understood to have psychological effects until decades after the park was completed. Casa Batlló, one of Gaudi's most famous residential buildings, was designed based on dreams where he experienced being a sea creature living in an underwater cave. The building's facade curves and undulates like ocean waves, with balconies that look like the mouths of sea anemones and windows that seem to glow with bioluminescent light. Gaudi described dreams where he could feel water flowing over his skin, experience the pressure changes of deep ocean currents, even sense the movement of fish and other sea creatures around his body. When he woke up, he'd translate these sensory experiences into architectural forms, creating buildings that seemed to be alive and breathing. The interior of Casa Batlló is even more biologically inspired than the exterior. The stairwell curves like the inside of a rib cage, with handrails that feel like bones and light fixtures that pulse like internal organs. The main living spaces have ceiling patterns that ripple like water surfaces, and the windows are positioned to create lighting effects that change throughout the day like the natural rhythms of marine life. But here's what really freaks people out about Casa Batlló. Visitors often report feeling like they're inside a living organism when they tour the building. The curved walls, the organic proportions, the way light moves through the spaces, it all combines to create a psychological experience. That's more biological than architectural. Modern neuroscientists who've studied people's responses to Gaudi's buildings have found that they activate brain regions associated with pattern recognition and spatial navigation in unusual ways. Being inside a Gaudi building apparently triggers the same neural responses that humans have when moving through natural environments like forests or caves. Casa Batlló, also known as La Pedrera, was designed based on dreams where Gaudi experienced being a mountain or rock formation. He described dreams where he could feel the slow geological processes that shape stone over millions of years. Understanding how wind and water carve rock into flowing, organic forms, the building's facade has no straight lines or right angles. Everything curves and flows like it was carved by natural forces rather than built by human hands. The stone surface seems to ripple and move, creating shadows that shift throughout the day like the play of light on a cliff face. The most remarkable thing about Casa Mela is its structural system. The building has no load-bearing walls. Instead, it uses a system of columns and arches that support the entire structure while allowing for completely flexible interior spaces. This was revolutionary for early 20th century architecture, and it required engineering calculations that pushed the boundaries of what was possible with available construction techniques. Gaudí claimed that his dreams had shown him how mountains support their own weight through internal structural networks that distribute forces throughout the entire rock formation. He applied this biological understanding to building design, creating architectural structures that worked more like living organisms than traditional buildings. The psychological effect of Gaudí's dream-inspired architecture on the people who lived and worked in his buildings was profound. Residents of Casa Mela reported feeling more creative and energized than they had in conventional buildings. There was something about the organic proportions, the flowing light, and the curved surfaces that seemed to have a positive effect on mood and well-being, but there were also disturbing psychological effects. Some people found Gaudí's buildings disorienting and unsettling, as if the organic architecture was somehow threatening their sense of what buildings should be. The lack of right angles and straight lines made it difficult for some people to feel psychologically secure in the spaces. Gaudí himself seemed to become increasingly consumed by his architectural dreams as he aged. By the early 1900s, he was spending almost all his time working on the Sagrada Familia, living in a small workshop on the construction site and dedicating his entire life to completing his dream cathedral. His behavior became increasingly eccentric and obsessive. He would spend hours standing in front of individual stone carvings, apparently communicating with them. Workers reported that he would sometimes argue with partially completed sections of the building, as if they were living creatures that weren't growing the way his dreams had promised. The most disturbing reports came from workers who claimed that Gaudí would sometimes become completely motionless while inspecting the construction, standing perfectly still for hours at a time with his hands pressed against the stone. When they tried to get his attention, he would seem confused and disoriented, as if he was having trouble remembering that he was a human being rather than part of the building itself. The religious symbolism of the Sagrada Familia was also derived from Gaudí's architectural dreams, but in ways that were far more literal and biological than traditional Christian iconography. He described dreams where he experienced the life of Christ from the perspective of the buildings and natural spaces where important events had occurred. The nativity facade of the Sagrada Familia, for example, was designed based on dreams where Gaudí experienced being the cave where Jesus was born. He could feel the weight of the stone above, sense the warmth of the animals and people sheltering inside, even experience the cosmic significance of the birth from the perspective of the rock walls that witnessed it. The stone carvings on the nativity facade are incredibly detailed and lifelike, depicting plants, animals, and human figures with a precision that seems almost photographic. But they're not just decorative elements, they're integrated into the building's structure in ways that make them seem like natural outgrowths of the stone itself. Modern botanists and zoologists who've studied the Sagrada Familia stone carvings have found that they're scientifically accurate representations of Mediterranean flora and fauna. The plants and animals carved into the facade aren't just generic decorative motifs. They're specific species that would have been present in the landscape of first-century Palestine. Either Gaudí was an incredibly skilled naturalist in addition to being an architect, or his dreams were providing him with detailed knowledge about biblical-era ecology that he couldn't have obtained through normal research methods. The Passion facade of the Sagrada Familia, which depicts the crucifixion and death of Christ, was designed based on dreams where Gaudí experienced being the cross itself. He described dreams where he could feel the weight of Christ's body, sense the pain and suffering of the crucifixion, even experience the moment of death from the perspective of the wood that supported the dying figure. The resulting architectural treatment of the Passion facade is much more austere and geometric than the organic naturalism of the Nativity facade. The stone surfaces are angular and harsh, with sharp edges and dramatic shadows that create a sense of violence and suffering. But the most disturbing aspect of the Passion facade is how it seems to affect visitors psychologically. People often report feeling unexpectedly emotional when they look at this part of the building, as if the stone itself is somehow communicating the pain and sacrifice of the crucifixion. The Glory facade, which is still under construction and will eventually serve as the main entrance to the Sagrada Familia, was designed based on dreams where Gaudí experienced the resurrection and ascension of Christ. He described dreams where he could feel the transformation from death to eternal life, experience the joy and triumph of salvation, even sense the cosmic significance of the resurrection from the perspective of the universe itself. The architectural plans for the Glory facade are the most complex and ambitious of the entire Sagrada Familia project. The design includes structural innovations that push the boundaries of what's possible with stone construction, creating spaces that seem to defy gravity and rise toward heaven with impossible lightness. But here's the thing. The Glory facade plans include architectural features that weren't technically feasible when Gaudí designed them in the early 1900s. The structural calculations required to build some of the planned elements have only become possible with modern computer modeling and advanced engineering techniques. It's as if Gaudí's architectural dreams were showing him building techniques that wouldn't be available for another century. The plans he left behind are so advanced that construction crews working on the Sagrada Familia today are still figuring out how to implement some of his designs. The most haunting aspect of Gaudí's story is how his architectural dreams seemed to predict his own death. In his final years, he claimed that his dreams about the Sagrada Familia had evolved from visions of the building's construction to visions of his own integration with the structure. He described dreams where he could feel himself becoming part of the cathedral, his consciousness merging with the stone and mortar in ways that transcended his individual human identity. He would wake up from these dreams feeling like he was more building than person, as if his life force was gradually transferring into the architectural structure he'd been creating. On June 10, 1926, Gaudí was struck by a tram while walking through Barcelona. He was so poorly dressed and disheveled that bystanders assumed he was a vagrant, and he didn't receive immediate medical attention. He died 3 days later in a hospital, leaving behind the unfinished Sagrada Familia and a legacy of architectural dreams that continue to influence building design more than a century later. But here's what's really strange. Construction workers at the Sagrada Familia have reported unusual experiences while working on the building that echo Gaudí's original architectural dreams. People claim to have sensations of the building communicating with them, providing guidance about how specific elements should be constructed. Some workers report dreams about the cathedral that provide solutions to construction problems, while others describe feeling like they're in psychic contact with Gaudí's spirit while working on the building. Whether these experiences are real or just psychological projections inspired by the building's extraordinary organic architecture, they suggest that Gaudí's dream visions somehow imprinted themselves on the physical structure itself. The Sagrada Familia is still under construction today, more than 140 years after Gaudí first began having dreams about it. The building has become a living testament to the power of architectural dreams, proving that sometimes the most impractical visions can create the most enduring and inspiring structures. Modern architects and engineers working on the Sagrada Familia use advanced computer modeling and 3D printing technology to implement Gaudí's designs, but they often find that his original dream-inspired plans are more sophisticated and innovative than anything they can create using contemporary design methods. The building continues to grow and evolve, guided by the architectural dreams of a man who claimed to experience consciousness from the perspective of stone and mortar. Whether you consider this spiritual inspiration or advanced psychological projection, the Sagrada Familia remains one of the most remarkable examples of how dreams can literally reshape our physical world. When architecture becomes alive, the dreamer dies, but the dream keeps growing, stone by stone, year by year, until the boundary between sleeping and waking. Consciousness becomes as fluid as the organic curves that define the building's impossible beauty. Gaudi's legacy proves that sometimes the most profound architectural innovations come not from technical knowledge or artistic training, but from the willingness to experience buildings as living entities that exist in the liminal space between dreams and reality. Japanese garden design has this whole tradition of Yum no Niwa dream gardens, where landscape architects would design spaces based on recurring dreams about perfect natural harmony. This wasn't just some casual artistic inspiration we're talking about. This was a serious spiritual practice that combined Buddhist meditation, Shinto nature worship, and incredibly sophisticated understanding of environmental psychology that wouldn't be scientifically recognized for centuries. The most famous case is probably Muzo Saseki, a 14th century Zen monk who claimed that Buddha himself appeared in his dreams and showed him how to arrange stones and water to create enlightenment landscapes. But Saseki wasn't just having pleasant spiritual visions about pretty gardens, he was receiving detailed technical instructions about how each rock placement would affect the spiritual energy of people walking through the space. Saseki's dream gardens were supposed to guide visitors through specific, emotional and psychological states as they moved along the carefully designed paths. Like you'd enter feeling stressed about your medieval Japanese problems, failed rice harvests, samurai warfare, whatever existential crises were keeping 14th century people awake at night, and by the time you reached the center of the garden, you'd achieve some kind of Zen clarity that would fundamentally change your relationship with reality. Now, this might sound like mystical nonsense, but here's where it gets really interesting. Modern psychologists and neuroscientists have actually studied these dream gardens and found that they do have measurable effects on brainwave patterns, stress hormones, and cognitive function. Either Saseki was way ahead of his time in understanding environmental psychology, or his dreams were tapping into some deeper knowledge about how human consciousness interacts with designed landscapes. The precision required to create these psychological effects through landscape design is absolutely staggering. We're talking about calculating the exact positioning of individual stones to create specific visual rhythms, the precise angles of pathways to influence walking pace and breathing patterns, even the strategic placement of plants to create scent combinations that would affect mood and mental clarity. Saseki claimed his garden dreams were incredibly detailed and specific. He described visions where he could experience the garden from multiple perspectives simultaneously, sometimes as a visitor walking through the space, sometimes as the stones themselves feeling the weight of people's footsteps, sometimes as the water understanding how its flow patterns would create different acoustic effects. But here's what's really strange about Saseki's dream guidance. He claimed that Buddha showed him how to design gardens that would look completely different depending on the season, the weather, and even the time of day. These weren't just static landscape compositions, they were dynamic, environmental systems that would create different spiritual experiences throughout the year. The Tenryuji Temple Garden in Kyoto, which Saseki designed based on his dreams, is a perfect example of this seasonal transformation approach. In spring, the cherry blossoms create a sense of impermanence and beauty that encourage contemplation of life's fleeting nature. In summer, the lush green foliage provides cool, shaded spaces that promote meditation and introspection. In autumn, the changing leaves create dramatic color patterns that inspire reflection on change and transformation. In winter, the bare branches and stone elements create a stark, minimalist aesthetic that focuses attention on essential forms and relationships. But achieving this level of seasonal coordination required incredibly sophisticated planning. Saseki had to understand the growth patterns of dozens of different plant species, the changing angles of sunlight throughout the year, even how different weather conditions would affect the acoustic properties of water features and wind through the trees. The most unsettling aspect of Saseki's garden dreams was how they seemed to include knowledge about plant biology and ecology that wasn't available through normal 14th century Japanese scientific understanding. His garden designs incorporated complex relationships between different plant species, soil conditions, water management systems, and microclimate creation that suggest access to botanical knowledge that was centuries ahead of its time. Modern landscape architects who've studied Soseki's gardens have found that they use principles of permaculture and ecological design that weren't officially developed until the 20th century. The strategic positioning of trees to create optimal growing conditions for understory plants, the integration of water features to support diverse plant and animal communities, even the use of specific stone types to influence soil chemistry, all of this demonstrates incredibly advanced understanding of ecological systems. The Saihoji Temple Garden, another of Soseki's dream-inspired creations, is particularly remarkable for its moss gardens. The garden includes over 120 different species of moss, arranged in patterns that create different textures, colors, and visual effects throughout the space. But managing such a diverse moss ecosystem requires precise knowledge of soil acidity, moisture levels, light conditions, and air circulation that would have been almost impossible to achieve through trial and error. Soseki claimed that his dreams showed him exactly which moss species should be planted in which locations, how to prepare the soil to support their growth, even how to design the garden's water features and tree placement to create the optimal microclimate conditions for different moss communities. The psychological effects of walking through Soseki's moss gardens are particularly intense. The soft, green surfaces seem to absorb sound and create an almost otherworldly sense of quiet and peace. Visitors often report feeling like they've entered a different dimension, where time moves more slowly and ordinary concerns fade away. Modern research has found that certain visual textures and color patterns do indeed affect brain chemistry in ways that can reduce stress and promote relaxation. The particular shade of green found in healthy moss, the soft, uniform textures, even the way moss-covered surfaces interact with light, all of this creates visual stimuli that trigger neurological responses associated with calm and well-being. The rock arrangements in Soseki's gardens were also based on incredibly specific dream guidance about how different stone shapes and positions would affect human psychology. The famous rock garden at Ryounji Temple, which Soseki designed late in his life, consists of just 15 stones arranged in a rectangular bed of white gravel. It looks almost absurdly simple, but the psychological impact on viewers is profound. Soseki claimed he had a recurring dream where he experienced being each of the 15 stones individually, understanding how their positions relative to each other would create visual tensions and harmonies that would guide visitors' attention and mental focus. The stones are positioned so that from any single viewing point at least one stone is always hidden from sight, creating a sense of incompleteness that encouraged contemplation and mental searching. The mathematical relationships between the stone positions follow complex geometric principles that weren't well understood in 14th century Japan. Modern analysis has found that the garden uses sophisticated concepts from visual psychology and cognitive science to create its meditative effects. But here's what's really disturbing about Soseki's story. His garden dreams apparently became so vivid and consuming that he gradually lost the ability to distinguish between his dream gardens and physical reality. His assistants reported that he would spend hours standing in empty spaces, apparently designing invisible gardens based on ongoing dream visions. He'd walk through temple courtyards, gesturing at empty air, explaining to his students how to position imaginary stones and water features. He'd give detailed instructions for caring for plants that didn't exist, or describe the seasonal changes he was observing in gardens that were still only concepts in his mind. The tradition of dream-inspired garden design that Soseki established continued for centuries in Japanese landscape architecture. Master gardeners would train their apprentices not just in practical horticulture and design techniques, but also in the spiritual disciplines needed to receive garden visions through dreams. These training methods included specific meditation practices, dietary restrictions, and sleep rituals that were believed to make students more receptive to landscape guidance from Buddhist and Shinto deities. Apprentice gardeners would sleep in temple gardens, fast before beginning new projects, and even take herbal preparations that were supposed to enhance the clarity of their design dreams. The herbal dream enhancement techniques used by Japanese garden masters are particularly fascinating. Their preparations included ingredients like lotus root, which affects brain chemistry in ways that can influence dream content, and various mushrooms that contain compounds known to alter consciousness. Either these gardeners were incredibly sophisticated in their understanding of psychoactive plants, or they were receiving divine guidance about which natural substances would enhance their spiritual receptivity. Some of Japan's most famous gardens were created through this dream guidance tradition. The Kinkakuji Golden Pavilion garden in Kyoto was designed by a master who claimed to receive detailed visions from the Buddha Amida about how to create a landscape that would represent the Pure Land paradise. The garden's careful integration of water, islands, trees, and architectural elements creates a visual harmony that's supposed to give visitors a preview of enlightened consciousness. The Ginkakuji Silver Pavilion garden was designed based on dreams, about moon viewing and the aesthetic appreciation of impermanence. The master gardener claimed his dreams showed him how to position stones and plants to create optimal conditions for contemplating the moon's reflection in water, and how different seasonal changes would affect the garden's ability to inspire philosophical reflection. But the most remarkable aspect of the Japanese dream garden tradition was how it influenced the development of the tea ceremony and other aesthetic practices. The small gardens attached to tea houses were designed based on dreams about creating perfect environments for achieving mental clarity and spiritual insight through the ritualized preparation and consumption of tea. These tea gardens were supposed to function as transitional spaces between the ordinary world and the heightened consciousness of the tea ceremony. Every element, the stepping stones, the water basin, the gate, the plantings, was positioned based on dream guidance, about how to prepare visitors psychologically for the meditative experience of the tea ritual. The integration of dream-inspired landscape design with other Japanese aesthetic practices created a comprehensive approach to environmental psychology that influenced everything from architecture to poetry to martial arts. The principle of creating design spaces that would promote specific mental and spiritual states became a central feature of Japanese culture. Modern Japanese landscape architects still study the classical dream gardens, not just as historical artifacts but as examples of sophisticated environmental design that achieved psychological effects that contemporary science is only beginning to understand. The tradition of using dreams and other forms of altered consciousness to guide landscape design continues in some contemporary Japanese garden projects. The legacy of masters like Muzo Saseki demonstrates that some of humanity's most beautiful and psychologically effective landscape designs may have emerged from the mysterious realm of dream consciousness, where spiritual insight and practical knowledge merge to create environments that can literally transform human awareness. The dream gardens of Japan remind us that the boundary between sleeping and waking consciousness, between spiritual vision and practical design, is far more fluid than we usually imagine. Sometimes the most profound insights about how to create healing, inspiring environments come not from technical knowledge, but from the willingness to listen to the landscape wisdom that emerges in our dreams. Now, before we drift too far into the realm of pure weirdness, let's think about what was actually happening with all these dream architects throughout history. Because when you step back and look at the broader picture, the idea that buildings and cities could be designed through dreams isn't actually that strange when you consider how different cultures throughout history have understood the relationship between sleeping consciousness and creative inspiration. Different cultures have had completely different ideas about what it means to dream about buildings and cities. And honestly, some of these cultural interpretations make the stories we just heard seem almost normal. Like, maybe we're the weird ones for thinking that architecture should only come from waking consciousness and technical training. In ancient Mesopotamia, we're talking about the cradle of civilization here, the people who basically invented cities, they believed that buildings had souls. Not metaphorical souls, but actual spiritual entities that existed independently of their physical structures. Architects weren't seen as creative designers who imposed their will on passive materials. They were viewed as midwives, helping building souls get born into the physical world through the process of construction. Dream visions weren't considered creative inspiration in this context. They were understood as direct communication from the building's soul, telling the architect how it wanted to exist in physical reality. The architect's job wasn't to design a building, but to listen carefully to what the building wanted to become and then help it achieve that form through skilled craftsmanship. This is actually a completely different way of thinking about the relationship between consciousness and creativity. Instead of the architect being the active creator and the building being the passive creation, the building becomes the active spiritual entity and the architect becomes the receptive servant. The dream visions were just the communication method that building souls used to convey their desires to human collaborators. The Code of Hammurabi, one of the earliest written legal systems in human history, actually includes specific laws about dream architecture fraud. Apparently, there were ancient contractors who would claim divine, building visions to justify charging higher prices or using more expensive materials. Which honestly sounds like something people would still try today. Sorry, the kitchen renovation is taking 6 months and costs 3 times what we estimated, but the spirit of your house appeared in my dreams and demanded premium marble countertops. But the legal recognition of dream architecture as a legitimate building practice suggests that this wasn't just religious superstition. It was an accepted part of how construction projects were planned and executed in ancient Mesopotamian society. The laws were designed to prevent fraud, not to eliminate dream-guided building altogether. Ancient Egyptians took dream architecture even more seriously than the Mesopotamians. They had specialized dream architects, priests who would sleep in temples for weeks at a time, recording their visions about how sacred buildings should be constructed. The most important pyramids and temples weren't designed by waking architects at all, but by these professional dreamers who devoted their entire lives to receiving building guidance from the gods. The really fascinating part is that Egyptian dream architects had to follow strict dietary and sleep protocols to ensure pure architectural visions. They'd fast for days before important building projects, sleep on special stones that were believed to enhance dream clarity, even take herbal preparations that we now know affect REM sleep patterns and dream content. They were basically ancient sleep hackers, optimizing their brain chemistry and sleep cycles for maximum architectural inspiration. The level of sophistication in their dream enhancement techniques suggests that they understood the relationship between consciousness, sleep states, and creative problem solving in ways that modern sleep science is only beginning to rediscover. The Egyptian dream architects also used specific architectural symbols and geometric relationships that were supposed to encode spiritual information into the physical structure of buildings. The proportions of the Great Pyramid, the positioning of the Sphinx, the layout of the temple complexes at Karnak. All of this was based on mathematical relationships that were revealed through dream visions and were believed to create bridges between the physical world and the realm of the gods. In ancient Greece, they believed that the goddess Athena, the patron deity of wisdom, crafts, and strategic warfare, would visit architects in dreams to share divine geometric principles. The Parthenon's proportions, those mathematical ratios that still make the building look perfect to modern eyes, were supposedly revealed in a dream sequence that lasted 3 nights and involved detailed, geometric instruction from Athena herself. But Greek dream architecture wasn't just about receiving divine inspiration. It was also about understanding the mathematical principles that governed both human psychology and cosmic harmony. The Greeks believed that certain geometric relationships could create buildings that would have beneficial effects on the people who used them, promoting everything from political wisdom to emotional balance to intellectual clarity. The architectural orders, Doric, Ionic, Corinthian, weren't just decorative styles. They were psychological technologies based on dream-revealed knowledge about how different proportions and visual rhythms would affect human consciousness. A Doric temple was supposed to promote strength and determination. An Ionic temple would encourage wisdom and contemplation, and a Corinthian temple would inspire artistic creativity and emotional refinement. Roman architects had a completely different approach to dream architecture. They believed that the spirits of conquered cities would appear in dreams to show Roman builders how to improve their construction techniques. It was like architectural imperialism through sleep. We're not just conquering your territory, we're also stealing your building techniques via our dreams. This led to the development of incredibly sophisticated construction methods that combined engineering knowledge from across the Roman Empire. The dome of the Pantheon, the aqueduct systems that supplied water to major cities, the road-building techniques that connected the empire, all of this was supposedly achieved by incorporating dream-received knowledge from the various cultures that Rome had absorbed. But Roman dream architecture was also practical in ways that earlier traditions weren't. Roman architects were less interested in spiritual symbolism and more focused on creating buildings that would effectively serve the needs of a vast, diverse empire. Their dream visions were apparently more concerned with engineering solutions than religious inspiration. The concrete formulations used in Roman construction, for example, were supposedly revealed through dreams that showed architects how to combine volcanic ash, lime, and other materials to create building substances that would actually get stronger over time. Modern engineers who've studied Roman concrete have found that it does indeed have self-healing properties that make it more durable than many contemporary building materials. During the medieval period, dream architecture became deeply connected with Christian theology and the belief that God could communicate directly with human beings through visions and dreams. But this also led to some really interesting tensions between divine inspiration and church authority. Cathedral dreams were obviously from God, assuming they promoted Orthodox Christian symbolism and didn't challenge church hierarchy. Castle dreams were probably acceptable as long as they served legitimate feudal purposes. But dreams about exotic or unusual architecture, anything that didn't look properly, Christian European, was considered potentially demonic and could get you accused of heresy. This led to fascinating forms of architectural censorship and self-censorship. Medieval architects would often describe their building visions in ways that made them sound more conventional and orthodox than they actually were. Some of the most innovative Gothic architecture probably came from dreams that were deliberately misrepresented to avoid accusations of demonic influence or theological error. The medieval church also developed elaborate systems for testing whether architectural dreams were truly divine in origin. Dream visions had to be consistent with biblical symbolism, promote proper Christian devotion, and result in buildings that served the church's institutional needs. Architects claiming divine inspiration had to undergo theological examination and demonstrate that their building plans supported orthodox religious practices. But despite these restrictions, medieval dream architecture produced some of the most innovative and beautiful buildings in human history. The Gothic cathedrals represent an incredible synthesis of spiritual vision, technical innovation, and artistic creativity that emerged from the tension between divine inspiration and institutional control. The Renaissance completely changed the cultural context for architectural dreams. Suddenly, dreaming about classical Roman and Greek buildings wasn't just acceptable, it was fashionable and intellectually prestigious. Architects would claim their designs came from dreams about ancient ruins. Even when they were just copying buildings they'd studied through conventional scholarship. But Renaissance dream architecture was also influenced by the period's interest in Neoplatonic philosophy and the belief that human consciousness could access universal principles of beauty and harmony through spiritual contemplation. Architects like Brunelleschi and Alberti believed that the perfect proportions for buildings could be discovered through dreams and visions that connected human awareness with cosmic mathematical principles. This led to architectural designs that were incredibly sophisticated mathematically, incorporating geometric relationships and proportional systems that were based on Platonic theories about the mathematical structure of reality. The dome of Florence Cathedral, the facade of San Lorenzo, the urban planning of ideal Renaissance cities. All of this emerged from the belief that architectural beauty could be achieved by discovering the mathematical principles that governed both human psychology and divine creation. Modern psychology and neuroscience have revealed some fascinating things about why architectural dreams have been so prevalent throughout human history and across different cultures. During REM sleep, our brains are incredibly active in areas responsible for spatial reasoning, three-dimensional visualization, and creative problem solving. The same neural networks that help us navigate through physical space during the day become hyperactive during dreams, potentially allowing for more complex spatial thinking than we can achieve while awake. For people who work with architectural and design problems, this might mean that their sleeping brains continue processing spatial challenges and sometimes generate innovative solutions that their conscious minds hadn't considered. There's also something called default mode network activation that happens during sleep, where different parts of the brain that don't normally communicate start sharing information. For architects, this could mean that artistic creativity, mathematical reasoning, practical engineering knowledge, and even emotional intuition all get to collaborate in ways that aren't possible during focused conscious thought. Recent neurological studies have found that people who work with spatial design problems are significantly more likely to have architecturally detailed dreams than the general population. It's like their brains are specifically optimized for processing three-dimensional spatial information during sleep, creating a natural tendency toward architectural dreaming. But here's what's really interesting. Modern sleep research has also found that architects' brains show unusual activity patterns during REM sleep, specifically in areas related to structural stability, load-bearing calculations, and material properties. Even while dreaming, architects' minds seem to be automatically checking whether their imaginary buildings would actually work in physical reality. This suggests that architectural education and professional experience literally rewire the brain in ways that make dream building more technically sophisticated and practically viable. The dream architects throughout history weren't just having random fantasies, they were accessing specialized forms of spatial intelligence that had been developed through years of conscious architectural training. There's even emerging research suggesting that human beings have evolved specialized neural circuits for imagining and testing architectural spaces, possibly because our survival as a species has always depended on our ability to create and modify shelter. We might all be natural-born architects in our dreams, but most of us just don't remember or act on those spatial visions. The consistency of architectural dreaming across different cultures and historical periods suggests that this isn't just cultural conditioning or religious belief. It might be a fundamental feature of how human consciousness processes spatial information and creative problem solving. Dreams about buildings and cities could be as natural and universal as dreams about flying or falling, which makes you wonder how many of the buildings around us today started as someone's dream. How many urban planning decisions, architectural innovations, and construction techniques emerged from the mysterious realm of sleeping consciousness? And what amazing structures might we be missing because we've forgotten how to take our architectural dreams seriously? Maybe the real question isn't whether dream architecture is possible, but whether we've lost touch with one of humanity's most important sources of creative and technical innovation. In a world where everything has to be rationally planned and scientifically verified, we might be missing out on the kind of intuitive spatial wisdom that built some of history's most remarkable and enduring structures. Frank Lloyd Wright claimed that his entire prairie school architectural style came from childhood dreams about living in harmony with the American landscape. But these weren't cute dreams about playing in fields or building tree houses. These were incredibly specific visions about how buildings should grow from the earth like natural formations, becoming part of the landscape rather than imposing upon it. Wright said he used to dream that he was lying flat on the Illinois prairie, slowly sinking into the ground until he became part of the landscape itself. In these dreams, he could feel what it was like to be the earth, experiencing the slow, patient processes of soil formation, sensing the movement of underground water, feeling the seasonal cycles of freezing and thawing that shaped the land over centuries. But here's where it gets really specific and weird. Wright claimed that during these earth dreams, he could understand exactly how buildings should extend horizontally rather than vertically, how they should use materials that came from the local landscape, how the interior spaces should flow like wind across grassland. He wasn't just imagining pretty houses, he was receiving detailed architectural instruction from the prairie itself. The psychological intensity of these landscape dreams seems to have been profound for Wright even as a child. His mother, Anna Lloyd Jones Wright, kept detailed notes about her son's unusual sleeping patterns and the elaborate drawings he'd create after waking up from what he called his prairie dreams. She wrote about finding young Frank standing in the family's Wisconsin fields at dawn, apparently trying to recreate the sensations he'd experienced in his dreams. He'd lie down on the ground and press his ear to the soil, claiming he could hear the earth's architectural heartbeat. He'd collect different types of stones, soil samples, even dried grasses, arranging them in patterns that supposedly matched the building layouts he'd seen in his sleep. The most disturbing aspect of Wright's childhood prairie dreams was how they seemed to include technical knowledge about construction and materials that he couldn't have learned through normal experience. His drawings from age 8 or 9 show sophisticated understanding of how to integrate buildings with natural topography, use local materials for both structural and aesthetic purposes, even create interior spaces that would feel connected to the surrounding landscape. When Wright began his professional architectural career in Chicago, working in Louis Sullivan's office, he claimed that his prairie dreams evolved and became more technically detailed. Instead of just experiencing the landscape from an Earth perspective, he started having dreams where he could see and feel how buildings should be positioned within specific natural settings. The Falling Water House, that famous house built over a waterfall in Pennsylvania, supposedly came from a dream where Wright was simultaneously the waterfall, the rocks, and the building. He claimed he could feel what it was like to be water flowing under a house, which informed how he designed the structure to work with the stream rather than blocking or redirecting it. This wasn't just poetic metaphor. Wright's design for Falling Water required incredibly sophisticated engineering to create a building that could span a natural waterfall without disturbing the water flow or compromising the structural integrity of the house. The cantilevers to extend the building over the water were at the very limits of what was possible with 1930s construction technology. Wright claimed that his waterfall dream showed him exactly how to position the building's supports to work with the natural rock formations, how to angle the cantilevers to distribute weight properly, even how to design the interior spaces so that the sound of flowing water would enhance rather than interfere with daily life inside the house. The acoustic design of Falling Water is particularly remarkable. The house is positioned so that the sound of the waterfall creates a natural white noise background that masks other sounds and creates an incredibly peaceful interior environment. This kind of acoustic planning requires detailed understanding of how sound behaves in natural settings, knowledge that Wright somehow possessed despite having no formal training in environmental acoustics. Wright's apprentices at Taliesin, his architectural school and workshop in Wisconsin, reported that he would sometimes wake up in the middle of the night and start redesigning buildings based on dreams he'd just had. He'd gather his students around and draw incredibly detailed architectural modifications by candlelight, explaining how his dream had shown him a better way to integrate the building with its natural surroundings. These nocturnal design sessions were apparently quite intense. Students describe Wright entering an almost trance-like state while drawing, as if he were channeling the landscape itself rather than working from conscious architectural knowledge. He'd speak about the buildings as if they were living entities that needed to find their proper relationship with the earth. One particularly well-documented case involved the design of the Unity Temple in Oak Park, Illinois. Wright had been struggling for weeks with how to create an innovative design for this Unitarian church that would express the congregation's progressive religious values while working within a very tight budget and small urban lot. After a series of prairie dreams, Wright developed his revolutionary concrete block construction system and the unified interior space that made Unity Temple one of the most influential religious buildings in American architecture. He claimed the dreams showed him how to use poured concrete in ways that would create both structural efficiency and aesthetic beauty, while designing interior spaces that would promote the kind of democratic, non-hierarchical worship that the Unitarian congregation wanted. The really bizarre part is that Wright claimed his dreams became more architecturally sophisticated as he aged, eventually including detailed information about new construction techniques and materials that hadn't been invented yet. His later designs called for construction methods that didn't become technologically feasible until decades after he'd conceived them. The Guggenheim Museum in New York which Wright designed in the 1940s but wasn't completed until after his death, required engineering innovations that pushed the boundaries of what was possible with mid-20th century construction technology. The spiraling ramp structure and the complex geometry of the building's interior spaces needed techniques that weren't fully developed until the computer age. Wright claimed that his dreams about the Guggenheim showed him exactly how to create the museum's unique spiral gallery system, but also included visions of how the building would be used by visitors decades in the future. He described dreams where he could experience the museum from the perspective of future art lovers, understanding how the gradually ascending ramp would create a specific kind of aesthetic experience that would enhance people's appreciation of the artwork. The psychological impact of Wright's prairie dreams on his personal life and relationships was significant. His wives and colleagues frequently described him as someone who seemed to be living partially in an alternative reality where buildings and landscapes were alive and constantly communicating with him. His second wife, Mama Borthwick Cheney, kept a detailed diary during their relationship, describing Wright's habit of walking through natural landscapes and carrying on conversations with invisible entities. He'd stop in front of particular trees or rock formations and explain to her the architectural lessons they were teaching him, as if the natural world was a living library of building wisdom. The most unsettling reports came from construction workers and contractors who worked on Wright's building projects. Many of them described Wright arriving at construction sites and making significant design changes based on dreams he'd had the night before. These weren't minor adjustments. Sometimes he'd completely redesign structural elements, because his dreams had shown him better approaches to integrating the building with its site. Workers on the Johnson Wax headquarters in Wisconsin reported that Wright would sometimes spend entire days standing motionless in partially completed spaces, apparently listening to something that nobody else could hear. When asked what he was doing, he'd explain that he was feeling how the building wanted to be completed, understanding the natural flow patterns that should guide the interior layout. The Johnson Wax building's famous lily pad columns, those innovative, mushroom-shaped supports that create the building's distinctive interior spaces, supposedly came from a dream where Wright experienced being a water lily growing in a pond. He claimed he could feel how the plant's structure distributed weight and created optimal growing conditions, which he then translated into architectural terms. The engineering required to create the lily pad columns was incredibly complex, involving new approaches to reinforced concrete construction that had never been attempted before. Wright's design was so innovative that building inspectors initially refused to approve it, convinced that the columns would collapse under the building's weight. Wright had to conduct expensive load testing demonstrations to prove that his dream-inspired structural system would actually work. The tests showed that the lily pad columns were not only structurally sound, but actually more efficient than conventional building methods, supporting more weight with less material. The natural lighting system in the Johnson Wax building was also derived from Wright's landscape dreams. The building uses a combination of translucent glass tubes and skylights to create interior, lighting that changes throughout the day in ways that mirror natural outdoor light patterns. Workers in the building report feeling more connected to natural rhythms despite spending their days in an essentially windowless environment. Wright's prairie-style houses, those low, horizontal buildings that became synonymous with early 20th century American domestic architecture, were all based on principles he claimed to have learned from his landscape dreams. The houses extend into their natural settings rather than standing apart from them, use materials that complement the local environment, and create interior spaces that feel connected to the outdoors. But the psychological effects of living in Wright's prairie houses were sometimes unexpected. While many residents loved the connection to nature and the innovative use of space, others found the buildings disorienting and difficult to live in comfortably. The low, horizontal proportions and the lack of clearly defined room boundaries could make people feel psychologically unstable. Some residents reported having unusually vivid dreams while living in Wright's houses, as if the buildings were somehow enhancing their connection to the unconscious realm where Wright claimed to receive his architectural guidance. Others described feeling like the houses were alive and responsive to their emotional states. Wright's organic architecture philosophy, the idea that buildings should grow naturally from their sites and serve the needs of their inhabitants, became one of the most influential approaches to architectural design in the 20th century. But it was based entirely on principles that Wright claimed to receive through dreams, about being part of the landscape rather than separate from it. The most haunting aspect of Wright's story is how his architectural dreams seemed to predict changes in how humans would relate to the natural environment. His designs anticipated the environmental movement, sustainable building practices, and the psychological need for architecture that connects people with natural systems. Wright died in 1959, but his dream-inspired approach to architecture continues to influence building design today. Contemporary architects working on sustainable and biophilic design projects often cite Wright's organic principles as foundational to their approach to creating buildings that support both human well-being and environmental health. The Taliesin Fellowship, Wright's architectural school, continues to teach design methods based on careful observation of natural systems and the integration of buildings with their landscape settings. Students still practice the kind of environmental awareness that Wright claimed to develop through his prairie dreams. Wright's legacy demonstrates that some of the most influential architectural innovations can emerge from the willingness to experience buildings and landscapes as living systems rather than mechanical constructions. His prairie dreams taught him that the best architecture doesn't impose human will on natural settings, but discovers ways for built and natural environments to enhance each other. Whether Wright was actually receiving architectural guidance through his landscape dreams, or whether his dreams were a way of accessing intuitive knowledge about environmental design, the results speak for themselves. His buildings continue to inspire people more than 60 years after his death, proving that dream-inspired architecture can create lasting connections between human consciousness and the natural world. In ancient China, there was this tradition of dream bridges, structures, that were built specifically to recreate architectural visions that appeared in collective dreams. This wasn't just some isolated weirdness that happened once or twice. This was an established cultural practice that continued for centuries, with entire communities dedicating years of their lives to building bridges that existed first in their shared unconscious minds. During the Tang Dynasty, there's a recorded case of an entire village having the same dream, about a bridge that could only be crossed by people with pure intentions. The dream was so vivid and so universally shared that the villagers spent 3 years building an exact replica of the bridge from their collective vision, working entirely from memory of something they'd experienced while asleep. Now, you might think this sounds like some kind of mass hysteria or religious delusion, but the historical record suggests something much stranger was happening. The dream was apparently so detailed and technically specific that the villagers were able to construct a fully functional bridge using engineering techniques that shouldn't have been available to them through normal Tang Dynasty knowledge. The strange thing is that this bridge had structural features that weren't officially invented until centuries later. It used a suspension technique that combined bamboo cables with stone anchor points in ways that demonstrated advanced understanding of load, distribution, and material science. The villagers somehow knew exactly how to weave the bamboo cables to achieve optimal tensile strength, how to position the stone supports to handle the dynamic forces of people walking across the bridge, even how to create a deck surface that would remain stable in high winds. But here's where it gets really weird. The bridge actually seemed to work the way the dream had predicted. People with impure intentions, however that was determined, would reportedly become dizzy or disoriented when trying to cross, while others could walk across normally without any problems. Historical accounts describe travelers who would approach the bridge with dishonest or harmful intentions suddenly feeling nauseous, losing their balance, or experiencing overwhelming anxiety that prevented them from completing the crossing. Meanwhile, people approaching with genuine, peaceful purposes would cross easily and often report feeling unusually calm and centered after reaching the other side. Modern engineers who've studied the remains of Tang Dynasty dream bridges have found structural features that could potentially create psychological effects through subtle visual and kinesthetic cues. The spacing of the deck planks, the rhythm of the suspension cables, even the angle of approach to the bridge, All of these elements might work together to influence people's mental states in ways that could reinforce beliefs about moral purity and spiritual worthiness. The bridge stood for over 400 years before being destroyed in a flood, but during that time it became a pilgrimage site for people wanting to test their moral purity, which is either a beautiful example of architecture serving spiritual purposes or the most elaborate placebo effect in history. What's really fascinating is that similar dream bridge traditions appeared in other parts of China during different historical periods, suggesting that this wasn't just an isolated cultural phenomenon. Communities would have collective architectural dreams, build the structures they'd envisioned, and then use them for spiritual and social purposes that seemed to work exactly as the dreams had promised. The psychological mechanism behind these collective architectural dreams remains mysterious. Either entire communities were accessing some kind of shared unconscious knowledge about engineering and construction, or there were cultural and environmental factors that could trigger similar dream content across large groups of people. Some historians have suggested that the dream bridge tradition was actually a sophisticated form of community problem solving, where technical challenges were processed collectively through shared dream experiences that allowed groups to access innovative solutions that wouldn't have emerged through conscious planning alone. The bridges built through this dream tradition became focal points for community identity and spiritual practice, proving that sometimes the most impractical inspiration can create the most meaningful and enduring structures. Even today, the sites where Tang Dynasty dream bridges once stood are considered sacred spaces where the boundary between sleeping and waking consciousness remains mysteriously permeable. The London Underground, that claustrophobic maze of tunnels that somehow gets millions of people where they need to go every day, was partially designed by engineers who claim to have recurring dreams about underground rivers and ancient burial tunnels. This sounds like the kind of thing you'd make up to explain why the tube system is so confusing, but the historical record suggests that dream-guided underground construction was actually a recognized practice. Among Victorian-era engineers, Charles Yerkes, one of the main financiers of the early tube lines and a guy who basically imported American subway building techniques to London, hired engineers based partly on their ability to dream underground. He believed that the best subway designers were people who could psychologically handle extended periods in subterranean spaces. And the way he tested this was by asking prospective employees about their dreams. Yerkes had developed this theory that people who were naturally suited for underground construction work would have dreams about tunnels, caves, and buried spaces. But he wasn't just looking for people who weren't claustrophobic, he was specifically seeking engineers who claimed to receive technical guidance about underground construction through their dreams. This might sound like eccentric hiring practices, but Yerkes had practical reasons for taking dream experiences seriously. Building London's underground railway system required working in incredibly challenging conditions, dealing with unknown geological formations, ancient foundations, buried rivers, and archaeological remains that weren't documented on any official maps. Several of the engineers working on the central and northern lines in the early 1900s reported having shared dreams about London's hidden underground geography. They'd dream about Roman sewers, plague pits, ancient riverbeds, medieval foundations, all the buried history that lay beneath the city like geological layers of human civilization. The weird thing is that when they actually started digging, they kept finding things that matched their dreams with unsettling accuracy. Ancient Roman walls exactly where someone had dreamed they'd be. Underground streams that had been forgotten for centuries but showed up in multiple engineers' sleep visions. Medieval building foundations that appeared in dream maps of areas that hadn't been excavated yet. One engineer, James Henry Greathead, who developed the tunneling shield technology that made deep-level tube construction possible, claimed he dreamed the entire route of the City and South London Railway before any surveys had been done. His dream included specific locations where they'd encounter different types of soil, underground obstacles, even the exact spots where they'd need to curve the tunnels to avoid existing basements and foundations. When they actually built the line, it followed Greathead's dream route almost exactly, including the seemingly random curves that turned out to be necessary to avoid. structural issues that the preliminary surveys hadn't detected. The dream-guided route was not only more efficient than the originally planned path, but it also avoided several major engineering problems that could have delayed construction for months. The psychological intensity of these underground dreams seems to have been significant for the engineers who experienced them. Greathead kept detailed dream journals throughout his career, and reading them is like stepping into the mind of someone who spent his sleeping hours exploring an alternative version of London that existed entirely below ground level. He described dreams where he could move through the earth like water, sensing the different layers of soil and rock, understanding how underground water moved through London's geology, even feeling the weight and pressure of the buildings above pressing down on the tunnel spaces. These weren't just visual dreams. They were full-body experiences of being underground that provided him with incredibly detailed knowledge about subsurface conditions. The most disturbing aspect of Greathead's underground dreams was how they seemed to include historical information about London's buried past that wasn't available through normal research methods. He'd dream about Roman London, medieval construction projects, even prehistoric river systems that had shaped the landscape millions of years before human habitation. His dream journals describe visions of Roman engineers building sewers and foundations using techniques that weren't documented in any historical records. He could see medieval builders digging cellars and tunnels, watch plague victims being buried in mass graves, even observe the gradual burial of ancient rivers as London grew and changed over centuries. When Greathead's construction crews actually encountered these historical remains during tunnel excavation, they consistently found things exactly as he'd described them in his dreams. Roman walls built with specific construction techniques, medieval foundations positioned at particular angles, even plague pits located precisely where his dream maps had indicated they would be. Modern archaeologists working in London have found that Greathead's dream records are remarkably accurate guides to the city's underground archaeological remains. His descriptions of Roman construction methods, medieval building practices, and historical burial sites have proven more reliable than many official historical documents. The engineering challenges of building London's underground railway system were enormous, requiring innovative solutions to problems that had never been encountered before. The engineers had to figure out how to dig tunnels through London's complex geology without disturbing the foundations of existing buildings, how to deal with underground water sources, even how to create ventilation systems that would keep passengers from suffocating in the deep-level stations. Many of these technical solutions supposedly came from dream guidance that provided the engineers with knowledge about underground construction techniques that were far ahead of their time. The tunneling methods used to build the early tube lines incorporated innovations that wouldn't be widely adopted until decades later. The deep-level station designs used for lines like the Northern and Piccadilly were particularly sophisticated, creating underground spaces that felt less claustrophobic than earlier cut-and-cover stations. The engineers claimed their dreams had shown them how to use lighting, ventilation, and spatial proportions to create underground environments that would be psychologically comfortable for large numbers of people. But the most remarkable aspect of the London Underground's dream-guided construction was how it seemed to create an underground transportation system that worked in harmony with London's hidden geography rather than fighting against it. The tube lines follow natural underground contours, avoid major geological obstacles, and connect with existing underground infrastructure in ways that suggest incredibly sophisticated understanding of the city's subsurface conditions. The ventilation systems for the deep-level lines were designed using principles that the engineers claimed to have learned from dreams about how air moved through natural cave systems. The result was underground stations that maintained surprisingly good air quality despite being far below street level, using passive airflow techniques that reduced the need for mechanical ventilation. The acoustic design of the underground stations was also influenced by dream guidance about how sound behaved in subterranean spaces. The stations were designed to minimize the harsh echoes and noise problems that plagued earlier underground railways, creating environments where announcements could be clearly heard and conversations could take place without shouting. Workers building the London Underground reported that the engineers would sometimes arrive at construction sites with significant modifications to the tunnel plans, claiming that their dreams had revealed better approaches to specific excavation challenges. These weren't minor adjustments. Sometimes entire sections of tunnel would be rerouted based on dream visions of underground obstacles or opportunities. The most documented case involved the construction of the Bank Station, one of the most complex interchange stations in the London Underground system. The original plans called for a relatively simple station design, but the lead engineer had a series of dreams that showed him how to create a much more sophisticated underground complex that would serve multiple tube lines and connect with existing buildings and infrastructure. The dream-inspired redesign of Bank Station required incredibly complex engineering, creating underground spaces that connected with the basement levels of nearby buildings, integrated with existing sewer and utility systems, even incorporated parts of Roman and medieval foundations into the station structure. When Bank Station was completed, it functioned exactly as the engineer had envisioned in his dreams, providing efficient passenger flow between multiple underground lines, while maintaining structural integrity despite being built in one of London's most geologically complex areas. The psychological effects of working underground for extended periods seems to have intensified the engineers' dream experiences. Many of them reported that spending their days in tunnels and underground construction sites made their dreams more vivid and architecturally detailed. Some engineers described feeling like they were living in two different versions of London: the surface city they experienced during their limited above-ground time, and the underground city they were creating through their construction work and dream visions. The underground London became as real and familiar to them as the streets and buildings above. The most unsettling reports came from engineers who claimed that their underground dreams continued long after the tube lines were completed. They'd dream about future expansions of the underground system, see visions of how the tunnels would age and change over time, even receive guidance about maintenance and renovation work that wouldn't be needed for decades. Several engineers left detailed predictions about how specific parts of the underground system would develop problems over time, based on dream visions of the tunnel's future condition. Many of these predictions proved remarkably accurate, helping maintenance crews identify and address structural issues before they became serious problems. The London Underground's dream-guided construction created an underground transportation system that has continued to function effectively for over a century, despite being built using 19th and early 20th century technology. The system has proven remarkably adaptable to changing transportation needs, and has served as a model for subway construction around the world. Modern engineers working on London Underground maintenance and expansion projects have found that the original dream-inspired designs were remarkably prescient, anticipating technical challenges and opportunities that wouldn't become apparent until much later. The legacy of the underground dream tradition demonstrates that some of the most successful infrastructure projects emerge from the willingness to take seriously the intuitive knowledge that can arise from extended engagement with challenging construction environments. The engineers who built London's underground railway system proved that dreams about buried spaces and hidden geography can provide practical guidance for creating underground infrastructure that serves both functional and psychological needs. The London Underground remains one of the most remarkable examples of dream-guided engineering, a transportation system that emerged from the collective unconscious wisdom of people who spent their lives working in the mysterious space between London's surface and its buried foundations. The underground railway system that emerged from these engineering dreams continues to carry millions of people through London's buried landscape every day, proving that sometimes the most practical solutions to urban transportation challenges come from the willingness to explore the subterranean realms of both the city and the unconscious mind. In 18th century Prague, there was an architect named Johann Blasius Santini who created some of the most bizarre Baroque buildings in Europe, and according to his assistants, he designed many of them while sleepwalking. This wasn't just occasional nocturnal wandering. Santini would apparently rise from bed in the middle of the night, walk to his drafting table, and create incredibly detailed architectural drawings without ever fully waking up. Santini's servants learned to leave paper and drawing tools ready for these nocturnal design sessions. They'd find him in the morning surrounded by complex architectural plans that he'd created during the night, with no memory of having drawn them. The level of detail and technical sophistication in these sleepwalking drawings was often superior to the work he produced while fully conscious. The buildings he designed while sleepwalking had this distinctive style that architectural historians still can't properly categorize. They combined Baroque elements with Gothic features in ways that shouldn't have worked, but somehow created these harmonious, almost mystical structures that seemed to exist in their own architectural universe. The Church of St. John of Nepomuk, which Santini designed entirely during sleepwalking episodes, has an interior layout based on mathematical star patterns that create unusual acoustic effects. When you speak certain words in specific locations within the church, your voice resonates in ways that sound almost supernatural, as if the building itself is responding to human speech. What's really unsettling is that Santini claimed he had no memory of designing these buildings. He'd wake up to find completed architectural plans that he didn't remember creating for buildings that he couldn't consciously understand. Yet when these structures were built, they worked perfectly and became some of the most celebrated architecture in Central Europe. Modern sleep researchers theorize that Santini might have had a rare form of REM sleep behavior disorder that allowed him to maintain fine motor control while dreaming. Essentially, his hands could draw what his sleeping mind was visualizing, creating a direct connection between unconscious architectural imagination and physical design creation. Santini's assistants reported that during his sleepwalking design sessions, he would sometimes speak in languages he didn't know while awake, apparently receiving architectural instruction from sources he couldn't access during normal consciousness. The drawings he created during these episodes included construction techniques and decorative elements that weren't part of his conscious architectural knowledge. The pilgrimage church of St. John of Nepomuk at Salina Hora, considered Santini's masterpiece, was designed entirely through sleepwalking sessions over a period of several months. The building's unique five-pointed star plan and its integration of Baroque and Gothic elements created a structure that influenced Czech architecture for generations. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Santini's sleepwalking architecture was how it seemed to anticipate architectural developments that wouldn't occur until much later. His buildings incorporated structural innovations and decorative techniques that weren't widely adopted until the 19th century, suggesting that his sleeping mind had access to architectural knowledge that was far ahead of his time. The psychological mystery of how Santini's unconscious mind could create such sophisticated architectural designs while his conscious mind remained unaware continues to fascinate researchers who study the relationship between creativity, consciousness, and specialized expertise. Workers who built Santini's sleepwalking designs reported that the buildings seemed to construct themselves, as if the architect's unconscious architectural vision had somehow been embedded in the plans in ways that guided the construction process. The resulting structures continue to amaze visitors with their unique combination of mathematical precision and organic, almost living architectural character. Santini's legacy proves that some of the most innovative architectural designs can emerge from the mysterious realm of sleeping consciousness, where the boundaries between imagination and technical knowledge dissolve to create structures that transcend the limitations of ordinary waking awareness. The buildings he designed while sleepwalking remain active places of worship and pilgrimage, suggesting that architecture created through unconscious processes can achieve spiritual and aesthetic effects that purely conscious design might never accomplish. Santini's sleepwalking architecture demonstrates that the most profound architectural innovations may come not from conscious planning and technical training, but from the mysterious creative intelligence that operates in the liminal space between sleeping and waking consciousness. Throughout history, there have been scattered reports of underground cities that were built based on collective dreams about subterranean refuge. This sounds like something out of a fantasy novel, but the archaeological evidence suggests that communities across different cultures and time periods have actually constructed elaborate underground complexes following shared visions they received while sleeping. In medieval Europe, during times of plague and warfare, entire communities would sometimes have shared dreams about safe underground spaces. These weren't just anxiety dreams about hiding from danger. They were detailed architectural visions of underground cities complete with ventilation systems, water sources, living spaces, even underground gardens and workshops. Some of these communities actually acted on their dreams, digging extensive underground complexes that followed the layouts from their collective visions. The underground city of Derinkuy in Turkey is one example, though official histories attribute it to early Christians fleeing persecution. Local oral traditions claim it was built following community dreams about underground sanctuary. What's particularly strange is that many of these dream-inspired underground cities included architectural features that seem impossibly sophisticated for their time periods. Ventilation shafts that create natural air circulation through complex underground networks, water systems that tap into underground sources that weren't known to exist, structural supports that modern engineers still find impressive. The Derinkuy underground city descends 8 levels deep into the earth and could shelter up to 20,000 people for extended periods. The engineering required to create such a complex, the ventilation system alone involves over 15,000. Individual air shafts suggests access sophisticated knowledge about underground construction, air circulation, and hydrogeology that shouldn't have been available to medieval communities. But here's what's really fascinating. The layout of Derinkuy matches descriptions found in medieval dream journals from communities hundreds of miles away. Monks in monasteries across Eastern Europe wrote about having shared visions of underground cities with multiple levels, connected by narrow tunnels with large communal spaces for gatherings and smaller chambers for individual families. The level of detail in these dream accounts is remarkable. They describe specific construction techniques for digging stable tunnels in soft rock, methods for creating underground water storage systems, even techniques for growing food in underground spaces with limited natural light. When archaeologists study the actual construction of places like Derinkuy, they find that the building techniques match the methods described in these distant dream journals with unsettling accuracy. Either there was some kind of underground construction knowledge being shared across medieval European communities, or multiple groups were accessing similar technical information through their collective dreams. The psychological aspects of these underground dream cities are equally mysterious. Many of them were designed not just as practical shelters, but as spaces that would support specific forms of community life and spiritual practice. Underground chapels, meditation chambers, even spaces that seem designed for collective dreaming and vision sharing. The Wieliczka salt mine in Poland includes underground chambers that were carved by medieval miners who claimed to receive guidance through dreams about creating sacred spaces deep beneath the earth. The intricate carved chapels and decorative elements found throughout the mine represent centuries of underground artistic work that supposedly followed patterns revealed in miners' collective visions. What's really unsettling about these underground dream cities is that several of them were abandoned suddenly, with no historical record of why. Archaeological evidence suggests that people just left, sometimes leaving behind perfectly prepared meals and personal belongings, as if they'd all decided to wake up from their underground dream at the same moment. At Derinkuy, archaeologists have found evidence that the city was actively inhabited for several centuries, then suddenly abandoned in the 14th century with no signs of invasion, disease, or other external pressures. Personal belongings, tools, even food stores were left behind, as if the entire population had simply vanished overnight. Similar patterns appear at other underground cities across Europe and Asia. Complex underground settlements that showed evidence of sophisticated planning and long-term habitation, then sudden abandonment with no clear explanation. It's as if entire communities would collectively decide that their underground dream had ended and it was time to return to surface life. Some historians have theorized that these mass abandonments were responses to environmental or geological changes that the underground communities could sense before they became apparent to surface dwellers. Perhaps the collective dreams that guided the construction of these cities also provided warnings about when it was time to leave. The ventilation systems in many of these underground cities were so sophisticated that they continued to function effectively centuries after abandonment. The air circulation networks at Derinku, for example, still provide fresh air to the deepest levels of the complex, using principles of natural airflow that modern engineers struggle to replicate. The water management systems were equally advanced. Underground cities like Kamakli in Turkey include complex networks of wells, cisterns, and drainage channels that maintained fresh water supplies and prevented flooding even during heavy rains or snowmelt. The engineering knowledge required to create these systems suggests understanding of hydrogeology that was far ahead of its time. But perhaps the most mysterious aspect of these underground dream cities was their apparent ability to influence the consciousness of people who lived in them. Historical accounts describe underground communities developing their own distinct cultures, spiritual practices, and even languages that were different from their surface-dwelling neighbors. Some of these underground cultures became known for their prophetic abilities and their skill at collective dreaming. Surface communities would sometimes consult underground dwellers for guidance about future events, as if living beneath the earth had given them access to different forms of knowledge and awareness. The underground city of Ascalon in Turkey includes chambers that seem specifically designed for group meditation and dream work. The acoustic properties of these spaces create unusual sound effects that can induce altered states of consciousness, while the positioning of air vents creates subtle changes in atmospheric pressure that affect brain chemistry. Modern researchers studying these underground meditation chambers have found that spending time in them does indeed affect brainwave patterns and can increase the likelihood of vivid dreams and visionary experiences. Either the medieval builders understood neuroscience in ways we're only beginning to rediscover, or their dream guidance included knowledge about how environmental factors influence human consciousness. The most haunting aspect of these underground dream cities is how they seem to have continued, influencing people's dreams long after their abandonment. Throughout history, there have been reports of people having dreams about discovering underground cities, then actually finding archaeological remains that match their dream visions. In the 1960s, a Turkish man named Hasan Korkmaz claimed he had recurring dreams about an underground city beneath his house in the Nevşehir region. When he actually started digging in his basement, following the layout from his dreams, he discovered the entrance to what turned out to be one of the largest underground complexes in Cappadocia. Similar stories continue to emerge from around the world. People have dreams about underground cities, follow their dream guidance to specific locations, and discover archaeological remains that had been lost for centuries. It's as if these ancient underground settlements somehow imprinted themselves on the collective unconscious, continuing to communicate their locations to future generations through dreams. The construction techniques used to build these underground cities were remarkably consistent across different cultures and time periods. Whether in Turkey, Poland, China, or other regions, the underground cities show similar approaches to ventilation, water management, and structural support that suggest shared technical knowledge or common dream guidance about underground construction methods. The spiritual significance of these underground cities also shows remarkable similarities across cultures. They're consistently associated with refuge, spiritual transformation, and contact with hidden sources of wisdom. The underground spaces seem to have been designed not just as practical shelters, but as environments that would facilitate specific types of consciousness and spiritual experience. The archaeological study of underground dream cities continues to reveal new insights about medieval engineering, community organization, and the relationship between built environments and human consciousness. These remarkable underground complexes demonstrate that some of humanity's most sophisticated construction projects may have emerged from collective visionary experiences that we still don't fully understand. The underground cities remind us that human beings have always been capable of creating extraordinary architectural achievements when inspired by shared dreams and visions. These buried settlements represent a form of collective creativity that transcends individual knowledge and technical training, accessing sources of wisdom that operate below the threshold of ordinary consciousness. Whether the underground cities were built following divine guidance, collective unconscious knowledge, or sophisticated environmental intuition, they continue to amaze and inspire people who discover their hidden chambers and tunnels. They stand as proof that sometimes the most remarkable human achievements emerge from the willingness to take dreams seriously and work together to make visionary experiences into physical reality. Modern urban planners and architects studying these underground cities have found inspiration for contemporary approaches to sustainable design, community resilience, and alternative ways of organizing human habitation. The underground cities offer models for creating built environments that work with natural systems rather than against them. The legacy of these underground dream cities suggests that human consciousness may have natural capacities for collective visioning and collaborative creation that we've largely forgotten in our individualistic, surface-oriented modern culture. Perhaps the most important lesson from these buried cities is that our ancestors knew how to dream together and build their shared visions into lasting physical reality. The underground cities continue to exist beneath our feet, silent testimonies to the power of collective dreaming and the human capacity to create extraordinary architecture when inspired by shared visions of refuge, community, and spiritual transformation. These buried cities represent some of humanity's most remarkable architectural achievements, proving that the most enduring and inspiring structures sometimes emerge from the depths of both the earth and the collective unconscious, where practical wisdom and visionary imagination merge to create spaces that serve both immediate survival needs and eternal human longings for sanctuary and transformation. If you're somehow still awake at this point, which would honestly surprise me, I hope you've enjoyed this strange journey through the history of dream architecture. It's fascinating to think that some of the most beautiful buildings in the world, some of the cities we live in and move through every day, exist because someone somewhere had a weird dream and decided to take it seriously. I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. Drop a comment below with your location, and maybe tell me about any strange dreams you've had about buildings or places. Do you ever dream about architecture? Have you ever had visions of spaces that don't exist but feel like they should? Next week, we'll be exploring more bizarre dream stories from history, so subscribe if you want to keep falling asleep to these strange tales from the past. Until then, sleep well, and who knows? Maybe tonight you'll dream up the next great architectural wonder. See you in your dreams.